Welcome, weary souls, to At Hollow Midnight, where the humdrum and the forgotten corners of history converge to form the perfect, gently distracting backdrop for your own restless nights. If the thrum of the modern world keeps your mind churning, perhaps the slow, deliberate unspooling of an inconvenient truth, a historical oddity, or a mundane misery from centuries past will offer a peculiar form of solace. Today we delve into a topic that at first glance might seem rather simple, even heroic, but upon closer inspection reveals itself to be an absolute marathon of discomfort, what it was truly like to sleep in a full suit of armor. You may want to brace yourself, for what follows is less an epic tale of valor and more a dry, detailed chronicle of metallic agony. This is Chapter 1, The Night's Restless Night. Let us begin by disabusing ourselves of a particularly persistent cinematic myth, a delightful fabrication that has for centuries painted a rather glamorous, if entirely inaccurate, picture of medieval slumber. The image, often conjured by sweeping historical dramas and valiant tales, features a knight, perhaps after a long day of valiant deeds, or a particularly arduous journey, collapsing into a heap, fully encased in his shining panoply, only to awaken refreshed and ready for more heroism. The reality, I assure you, was significantly less heroic and considerably more fraught with pins, pokes, and the profound indignity of being unable to scratch an itch on your nose. The notion of a knight routinely sleeping in his armor is, to put it mildly, absurd. It's akin to suggesting a modern soldier regularly sleeps in a fully deployed hazmat suit, complete with respirator and self-contained breathing apparatus, simply because it's protective. One might do it in the direst of emergencies, a situation of immediate, overwhelming peril, but not as a matter of course. And even then, it would be a night of utter, unmitigated misery. Imagine, if you will, the sheer weight. A full suit of plate armor by the 15th century could weigh anywhere from 50 to 70 pounds, distributed relatively evenly across the body, which was a marvel of engineering for its time. But that distribution was for standing, for moving, for fighting, for charging on horseback. It was not, emphatically not, for lying down. When you attempt to recline, all that carefully balanced weight shifts, concentrating itself into pressure points that instantly transform into sources of exquisite discomfort. Your shoulders, your hips, the small of your back, your elbows, your knees suddenly. These are not merely joints and bony prominences, but anvils pressing against a very thin layer of padding, usually a gambeson, which, while offering some protection and cushioning, was primarily designed to absorb blows, not to facilitate restful sleep. A gambeson itself was a quilted garment, often thick and multi-layered, which, in combination with the armor, created a microclimate of astonishing warmth, even on a cool night. So, in addition to being pressed into the ground by several dozen pounds of steel, you would be simmering in your own accumulated body heat, a private, personal sauna of sweat and stale air. The gauntlets, those articulated steel gloves, are suddenly no longer a shield for your hands, but a rigid, unyielding cage. Trying to curl your fingers to clench a fist, or even simply to relax your hand, becomes an exercise in futility. The individual plates that allow for movement during combat now conspire to prevent any natural repose. Your fingers are perpetually splayed or awkwardly bent, each joint aching with the phantom limb sensation of freedom denied. And the greaves, the shin and calf protectors, along with the sabatons, the steel boots, lock your legs into a nearly inflexible posture. You cannot cross your legs. You cannot bend your knees naturally. You certainly cannot bring your knees up to your chest in any semblance of a fetal position. Your legs are fixed, stiff pillars, prone to cramps and the prickling sensation of pins and needles as circulation struggles against the steel confines. Any slight shift, any involuntary twitch of a muscle is met with the unforgiving embrace of cold, hard metal. Then there is the chest plate, the cuirass, a formidable piece designed to protect your vital organs. It is also a significant barrier to the simple act of breathing. Lying on your back, the weight of the steel presses down on your diaphragm, making each inhalation a conscious effort, a shallow, restricted gasp for air. Turning onto your side, if such a feat is even possible, without the assistance of a squawking squire, only concentrates the pressure onto one ribcage, creating a new, singular point of acute distress. The sheer claustrophobia, a primal, ancient fear of being confined, would creep in. Your world shrinks to the metallic shell encasing you. The sound of your own breathing echoes within the helm, amplified and distorted, a constant reminder of your metallic prison. Each creak of the steel, each minute, shift as the various lames and plates rub against one another, would be an incessant, grating symphony of discomfort, a lullaby of rust and resistance. And the helmet, the grandest and most iconic piece of armor, while often removed for any extended period of rest, in a true emergency, it might remain. Imagine the limitations. Your field of vision, already narrowed to a mere slit or a few small apertures, becomes an oppressive tunnel. Peripheral awareness is eradicated. The air within quickly grows stale, heavy with the scent of your own breath, mixed with the metallic tang of the steel and the faint, unsettling aroma of aged sweat and oil. Your ears, encased, would amplify every rustle, every distant whisper, every beat of your own blood, while simultaneously muffling the true sounds of the outside world. Trying to sleep with a helmet on is akin to trying to sleep with a bucket over your head, only that bucket weighs 10 pounds and offers no natural ventilation. The weight on your neck, already substantial during the day, becomes a constant, grinding ache when you lie down, forcing your head into an unnatural, often slightly elevated position that strains the cervical spine. Sleep, if it came at all, would be a shallow, fragmented affair, plagued by vivid, uncomfortable dreams of being perpetually trapped or endlessly falling. Consider the indignities. The inescapable need to use the privy, for instance. A knight in full armor, particularly without assistance, would find this a task of Herculean effort and profound embarrassment. Simple adjustments, scratching an itch on your nose, rubbing tired eyes, or stretching a cramped limb, are rendered impossible. You are a living statue, capable only of the most limited, rigid movements. And the sheer impracticality. What if you needed to roll over to avoid a draft, or shift position because of an ache? It would require a conscious, laborious effort, perhaps even a grunt of exertion, turning what should be an unconscious act of comfort into a performance of engineering and strained muscle. The cool night air, if it permeated the enclosed space, would seep into the steel, chilling the metal, which in turn would leach the warmth from your body, creating a cycle of shivers followed by uncomfortable warmth. The very material meant to protect you from harm would, in this context, become an instrument of torment, a constant, unyielding reminder of your predicament. So, the next time you picture a knight, heroic and unyielding, remember the likely reality of any overnight vigil in his gleaming shell. It was not a testament to stoicism, but rather a grueling endurance test, a night spent in a rigid metallic coffin of his own choosing or circumstance. The creak of the joints, the press of the plates, the restricted breath, the maddening inability to find even a moment's true repose. This was the knight's restless night, a symphony of discomfort played out in steel and sweat. It was quite plainly a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad idea. And truly, don't try it. Chapter 2. The weight of history. We have established, with perhaps a touch of grim amusement, that the idea of a knight casually dozing off in his full suit of armor is less a heroic vignette and more a darkly comedic scenario of physical distress. But Chapter 1 merely scratched the surface of the physical burden, the sheer, unrelenting weight of history, literally strapped to one's body, intent on preventing any semblance of restful slumber. Let us delve deeper into this metallic embrace, this armored anti-lullaby, and perhaps, by comparing it to our own trivial modern sleep woes, truly appreciate the night's particular brand of nocturnal misery. Consider for a moment your own nightly routine. You might complain about a pillow that's too firm or too soft, a sheet that bunches uncomfortably, or the maddening crinkle of a forgotten snack wrapper under the bed. Perhaps the thermostat is set a degree too high, or the distant hum of the refrigerator disrupts your peace. These are, of course, minor inconveniences, easily rectified, the stuff of modern first-world bedtime complaints. Now, take all of those minuscule irritations, amplify them by a factor of several hundred, and then encase yourself in 50 to 70 pounds of unforgiving steel, each piece designed for protection, not for repose. The weight of the armor, distributed so artfully for a man standing, fighting, or riding, became an instrument of exquisite torture the moment gravity was allowed to pull it horizontally. Imagine lying on your back, the solid, unyielding cuirass pressing down, not merely on your chest, but on your entire torso. Every breath becomes a conscious, labored effort, as if a small, rather stubborn child were sitting directly on your diaphragm. The sensation is akin to trying to breathe deeply while being simultaneously hugged by a very enthusiastic, very strong, and entirely unyielding robot. You might find yourself gasping, or at least consciously expanding your lungs against the resistance rather than letting the natural rhythm of breath take over. And then, as if to add insult to injury, the backplate, while offering crucial spinal protection during combat, now acts as a series of bony protrusions digging into your shoulder blades, your lower back, and the prominent curve of your spine. Have you ever tried to sleep on a particularly lumpy mattress, or perhaps a sofa with an aggressively uncooperative cushion? Multiply that sensation by 1,000, and replace the offending lump with a precisely engineered, cold, and utterly unyielding piece of metal that conforms to no natural human curve. And let us not forget the limbs. The vambraces, the steel arm guards, and the gauntlets. Those articulated steel gloves effectively transform your arms from supple, flexible appendages into rigid, heavy clubs. Trying to cross your arms to fold them beneath your head, or even simply to let them rest naturally at your sides, becomes an impossibility. The individual plates, designed to allow movement during a swing or parry, now conspire to lock your limbs into an unnatural, slightly bent, and deeply uncomfortable position. Imagine trying to sleep with your elbows perpetually propped up on invisible, sharp-edged blocks. Or consider the feeling of having your hands forced into a perpetual open-palmed rigidity, unable to curl, unable to relax, each finger joint aching with the phantom memory of freedom. This is not merely numbness. It is a dull, pervasive ache that settles deep into the bones, accompanied by the maddening sensation of pins and needles, as circulation, perhaps slightly impeded, struggles to reach your encased extremities. The legs fare no better. The greaves and cuisses protecting the lower and upper legs respectively, coupled with the sabatons, the steel foot coverings, turn your lower body into two immovable pillars. You cannot bend your knees naturally. Certainly, you cannot bring them up to your chest in any comforting fetal position. Your legs are fixed, extended like planks of wood. Have you ever woken up with a severe cramp in your calf, or the entirely unpleasant feeling of your foot having fallen asleep? Now imagine that sensation permeating both legs from hip to toe, not just for a few moments, but for the entire duration of your attempted rest, brought on by the very mechanism designed to protect. The very act of shifting position, a subconscious dance we perform dozens of times a night to find comfort, would become a monumental, clanking effort, akin to trying to reorient a small, very heavy, and very metallic mannequin. Then there is the issue of heat. Beneath that impressive shell of steel, a knight wore a gambeson, a thick, quilted garment designed to absorb the impact of blows and prevent chafing. While essential for protection, it was also by its very nature an incredibly efficient insulator. So, you have a thick, padded suit underneath a full-body metallic oven. The microclimate within that armor quickly becomes a humid, stifling chamber. On a cool night, the metal would eventually draw the warmth from your body, becoming cold and clammy against the gambeson, leading to shivers. But as your body heat built up, it would be trapped, leading to a rapid transition from cold discomfort to an oppressive, sweat-inducing warmth. It's like sleeping in a sleeping bag that's far too warm, then suddenly finding yourself encased in a giant, very heavy metal box. The sweat would pool, trickle, and cling, exacerbating the itching that you, in your metallic prison, could not possibly scratch. Think of the maddening itch on your back, just out of reach, and then imagine that itch beneath layers of padding and steel, utterly unassailable. And the helm. While often removed for any attempt at rest, in dire circumstances, or if a knight was truly caught unawares, it might remain. This truly elevated the experience from mere physical discomfort to a profound psychological ordeal. The world shrinks to the small, dark, stuffy confines of your helmet. Your breath, warm and stale, recirculates, filling the small space with an increasingly unpleasant aroma. Every rustle, every distant whisper, the thrum of your own heartbeat, all are amplified by the enclosing metal, creating a cacophony of internal noise that prevents the mind from drifting into peaceful slumber. It is the auditory equivalent of having a perpetually dripping faucet right next to your ear. Only the faucet is your own circulatory system, and the drip is the sound of your increasingly labored breathing. The weight on your neck, already considerable during the day, becomes a constant, grinding pressure when you attempt to lie down, forcing your head into an awkward, slightly elevated position that strains the cervical spine. It's like trying to sleep with a bowling ball balanced precariously on your forehead. Only the bowling ball is also restricting your vision and your ability to smell anything other than yourself. The absurdity of it all becomes starkly apparent when one considers the absolute triviality of our modern sleep complaints. We fuss over thread counts, the perfect firmness of a mattress, the ideal number of pillows. A knight, by contrast, would likely have traded all the silk sheets and memory foam in the world for the simple ability to stretch out, to scratch an unreachable itch, or to simply, truly relax his limbs. The weight of his history, the very apparatus of his profession, became his nocturnal tormentor. It was a constant, unyielding reminder of his predicament, a metallic shroud that precluded any true rest. Sleep, if it arrived at all, would have been a shallow, fragmented affair, riddled with the subconscious awareness of confinement, of pressure points, and of the maddening, undeniable reality that he was, quite literally, sleeping in a very expensive, very heavy, and very uncomfortable tin can. The physical burden was not merely a matter of pounds and ounces. It was a pervasive, inescapable presence that defined every moment of his attempted, and almost certainly failed, rest. Chapter 3. Rust never sleeps. We have already traversed the peaks of physical discomfort and the valleys of claustrophobia inherent in attempting to sleep while encased in medieval plate armor, a truly remarkable testament to human ingenuity in both protection and, inadvertently, self-imposed torment. But the tale of the knight's nocturnal woes does not end with mere pressure points and stifled breaths. Oh no, dear listener. For beneath the gleaming surface of that formidable steel lay a deeper, more insidious threat, one that haunted a knight's waking hours and, indeed, likely seeped into his few, fragmented moments of restless sleep. The relentless, omnipresent specter of omnipresence. Steel, for all its formidable strength and impressive ability to deflect blows, is, at its core, simply iron with a dash of carbon, and iron, when exposed to the capriciousness of oxygen and moisture, has a rather unfortunate tendency to revert to a more natural, oxidized state. This, of course, is what we so charmingly refer to as rust. It is a slow, creeping form of decay, an inexorable march of corrosion that, if left unchecked, can turn a magnificent, gleaming panoply into a brittle, pitted, and utterly useless relic. For the medieval knight, whose very life, livelihood, and indeed social standing depended upon the pristine condition of his armor, rust was not merely a cosmetic blemish. It was an existential threat, a constant, nagging anxiety that likely burrowed its way into the deepest recesses of his weary mind. Imagine the scenario. The knight, having, by some miraculous feat of endurance, survived a night of attempting to sleep in his armor, a choice he would have only made in the most dire and immediate of military emergencies, when the very ground beneath him might be overrun at any moment. He rises, stiff and aching, every joint protesting, his body clammy with sweat. But even as he struggles with the immediate physical pain, his eyes, still heavy with interrupted sleep, would instinctively scan the surface of his precious steel. Did a droplet of condensation form on the pauldron overnight? Did the dampness of the earth beneath his makeshift bed seep into the metal of his sabatons? Had the morning mist, thick and clinging, begun its silent corrosive work? Every slight discoloration, every faint orange stain, every gritty patch would send a jolt of dread through him, a stark reminder that even in the supposed sanctuary of sleep, his most vital possession was under attack. Rust, you see, does not discriminate. It does not care if you are tired, if you are cold, or if you have just fought a dragon, an unlikely but dramatically illustrative scenario. It cares only for the chemical reaction, the slow, deliberate consumption of iron. And the medieval world, bereft of sophisticated climate control or modern rust-inhibiting alloys, was a veritable breeding ground for the stuff. Rain, sleet, snow, the pervasive humidity of a castle dungeon, the salt-laden air by the coast, the sweat of the knight's own body, all were eager conspirators in the relentless war against polished steel. A long campaign, a siege that stretched for weeks, even a simple journey through changeable weather, could spell disaster for an inadequately maintained suit. The consequences of neglect were immediate and profound. A rusty joint, perhaps the articulation in elbow or knee, would quickly seize up, transforming fluid movement into a series of grating, awkward jerks. The knight would find his very ability to fight compromised, his agility dulled, his parries slowed by the recalcitrant steel. A rusted breastplate, while still offering some protection, would become brittle in weakened spots, its structural integrity compromised, transforming a reliable shield into a potential death trap against a well-aimed blow. And then there was the sheer ignominy of it. A rusty suit of armor was not merely inefficient. It was a visible declaration of poverty, neglect, or lack of discipline. A true knight, a man of standing and honor, was expected to present himself and his equipment in pristine condition. A gleaming, well-maintained suit was a testament to his wealth, his diligence, and the care provided by his squires. A rusty suit whispered tales of slovenliness, of diminished means, of a knight who cared little for his appearance or his effectiveness. Such whispers could ruin a reputation faster than a lost battle. So, how did this ceaseless battle against corrosion manifest in the knight's subconscious? Imagine the dreams born of exhaustion and anxiety. He might dream of his glorious armor, once so bright and reflective, slowly, inexorably turning to a dull, flaking orange before his eyes. He tries to polish it, but the rust spreads faster than his efforts, consuming it utterly until it crumbles to dust in his hands, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Or perhaps he dreams of battle, but his sword arm, encased in a gauntlet of solid rust, refuses to move, stuck fast as his enemy bears down on him. The screech of corroded metal, A sound that would send shivers down his spine in waking life might become the soundtrack to his nightmares. The creak of an unoiled hinge turning into the shriek of metal being eaten alive. The grinding of plates becoming the sound of his very defenses dissolve. He might awaken with a jolt, his heart pounding, convinced he can smell the metallic tang of oxidation in the stale air of his sleeping quarters, only to slowly realize it was merely a phantom of his tormented mind. The daily ritual of armor care was not a mere chore. It was a sacred duty, a constant physical manifestation of the knight's dedication to his craft and his survival. Each morning, after the agonizing process of extracting himself from the metal shell, if he had indeed slept in it, which again was rare and dreadful, or simply waking in the gambeson with the armor nearby, the true work began. Squires, often young men hoping to earn their own spurs, would spend hours laboriously polishing each plate, rubbing away any incipient rust with fine sand and oil, painstakingly working the hinges with grease or special waxes to ensure smooth, silent movement. This was not a quick wipe-down. This was a meticulous, detailed operation, ensuring that every rivet, every joint, every surface was free from the insidious grip of corrosion. For a knight on campaign, far from the conveniences of a permanent forge or well-stocked armory, this maintenance became even more critical, and yet more difficult. Improvised methods, the scraping away of rust with grit and sweat, would become the norm. The constant fear would be of being caught unprepared, of a sudden skirmish while his armor was still being worked on, or worse, of his armor failing him mid-combat because of a patch of unseen corrosion. This mundane, yet vital, aspect of a knight's life offers a strange parallel to our own modern anxieties, though ours are infinitely less life-threatening. We fret over the battery life of our phones, the inexplicable slowness of our internet connection, the small scratch on the screen of our expensive tablet. These are our modern vulnerabilities, our digital rust. We constantly maintain them, updating software, charging diligently, wiping smudges from screens. But imagine if the failure of your phone meant the immediate loss of your livelihood, your social standing, and potentially your life in a direct confrontation. That, dear listener, was the knight's reality. His concern over rust was not merely aesthetic, it was a matter of survival. It was a cold, hard, metallic fact that permeated every aspect of his existence, including, undoubtedly, his fleeting moments of attempted rest. So, while we might pity the knight for his uncomfortable sleep, let us also spare a thought for the perpetual low-level hum of anxiety that accompanied his most prized possession. The glint of moonlight on his armor, far from being a romantic vision, might simply have been a stark illumination of the battle that awaited him each morning, the relentless, silent war against the elements. The thought of rust, of slow, creeping decay, was a constant companion, a ghost in the machine, whispering its insidious threats even as the knight tried, in vain, to find a moment of peace. Rust never slept, and in a very real sense neither did the knight, constantly on guard against its silent, destructive advance. It was a worry that weighed on him, perhaps even more than the steel itself. Chapter 4. The Clanking Lullaby. We have already explored the manifold miseries of attempting to sleep in a full suit of medieval armor. The relentless weight that presses your very essence into the unforgiving earth, the suffocating embrace of the steel that denies any natural stretch or shift, and the pervasive underlying anxiety of rust, that silent creeping destroyer. But now, dear listener, let us turn our attention to perhaps the most immediate, most maddening, and most inescapable torment of all, the soundscape. For a knight attempting to find repose in his metal shell was not met with the gentle hush of the night, nor the soft rustle of leaves, nor the distant chirping of crickets. Instead, he was serenaded by a perpetual, personalized symphony of metallic discord, a clanking lullaby that served only to underscore the profound absurdity of his predicament. Imagine, if you will, the knight, exhausted beyond measure, having, against all sane advice, decided to remain fully armored for the night. Perhaps he is on watch, a sentry whose life literally depends on immediate readiness. Perhaps he's in enemy territory, where disarming, even partially, would be an act of suicidal folly. He attempts to lie down, a seemingly simple act that for him becomes an elaborate, multi-stage operation. The first sound is often a dull, resonant thud as the large, concave backplate of his cuirass makes decisive contact with the ground or the thin, hard pallet beneath him. It's not a soft landing. It's the sound of solid steel meeting solid surface, a declaration of intent from the armor itself. You are here. You are heavy. You are not moving easily. This is followed by the scrape and grind of the pauldrons, those magnificent shoulder guards as they settle, their articulated plates protesting against the sudden shift in gravity. Each plate, designed for graceful movement in combat, now conspires to create an irritating, grinding friction, a mechanical whisper of discontent. Then comes the full body adjustment, the attempt to find a position that is merely uncomfortable rather than excruciating. This is where the true orchestra of torment begins. As the knight shifts his weight, however minutely, a cascade of metallic sounds erupts. The counters, protecting the elbows, scrape against the vambraces, the arm guards. The polins at the knees groan against the cuisses, the thigh protectors. The articulated lames of the gauntlets, those steel gloves, emit a chorus of small, sharp clicks and scrapes with every attempt to flex or relax the fingers, an impossible endeavor in itself. It is a concert of resistance, each metallic component rubbing, sliding, or knocking against its neighbor, a cacophony of small, insistent sounds that shatter any hope of quiet. It's not unlike trying to sleep inside a very large, very intricate, and very noisy wind chimes. Only the chimes are made of 5 mm thick steel and are attached directly to your body. Even the smallest involuntary twitch of a muscle, the subconscious adjustment of a limb that we take for granted in an unarmored state, is met with an immediate, jarring response. A leg might involuntarily spasm, causing the greaves and sabatons to clang together with a dull, heavy clunking, echoing through the helmet and sending a jolt of wakefulness through the knight's already frayed nerves. A slight shift of the torso, an attempt to relieve pressure on a hip, results in the deep, resonant groan of the cuirass as it grinds against the backplate, a sound that speaks of immense weight and unyielding rigidity. These are not gentle, soothing sounds. There's no gentle with-hump-thumpum of a heart, no soft heaving of breath. Instead, it is the constant percussive reminder of the hundreds of meticulously crafted pieces of metal that encase him, each one a miniature noisemaker designed inadvertently to prevent the very sleep he so desperately craves. And if, by some miracle, the knight manages to drift into a shallow, fitful doze, any shift in his sleep, any dream-induced flail of a limb, will instantly snap him back to agonizing awareness. The slightest movement, the unconscious turning of his head, even the subtle expansion of his chest with a deeper breath, will trigger a fresh wave of metallic protests. The individual plates of the gorget, protecting his neck, might squeak as they rub against each other, creating a high-pitched, insistent sound right next to his ears. The breastplate might creak under the subtle shifts of his diaphragm. The leather straps, stretched taut and perhaps drying out, might emit a protesting squeal as they shift against the metal, a sound that, like fingernails on a chalkboard, is specifically designed to grate on one's very soul. The helmet, if still worn, adds another layer of auditory oppression. As previously mentioned, it acts as an amplifier for the knight's own internal sounds. The dull thrum of his heartbeat against the metal, the whoosh and hiss of his breath echoing within the confined space, the gurgle of his stomach. each sound distorted and magnified into an inescapable auditory landscape. But it also muffles the outside world, creating a peculiar, unsettling isolation. He might hear the distant cry of an owl or the whisper of the wind, but they would be indistinct, ghostly sounds, filtered through the steel, while the internal symphony of his own metallic prison raged on loud and clear. It's a sensory deprivation paradox. Both an overwhelming flood of internal noise and a perplexing lack of connection to the outside world. Beyond the immediate metallic sounds, there were the less obvious but equally insidious auditory annoyances. The subtle ing-scraper of male coif against gambeson fabric, the faint clinking of a dangling chain or an ornamental buckle, the barely perceptible hiss of metal cooling against the night air. These were the background noises to the main metallic show, the subtle details that ensured no moment of true quiet was ever achieved. It was a 360-degree auditory assault, a perpetual reminder of the armor's rigid presence, its uncompromising nature, its utter disdain for comfort. The psychological toll of this constant noise cannot be overstated. Sleep is, for most, a refuge, a quiet retreat where the mind can process and rest. For the knight in armor, sleep became another battlefield, an internal skirmish against the very tools of his trade. Every clang, every scrape, every groan of metal was a fresh assault on his weary mind. He might try to block it out, to focus on the rhythmic sound of his own muffled breathing, but the armor would always win, intruding with another metallic protest, pulling him back to the harsh reality of his situation. The lullaby was not one of gentle slumber, but of perpetual disturbance, a jarring mechanical rhythm that denied him the peace he so desperately needed. One could almost imagine the knight, eyes staring into the metallic darkness of his helm, wishing for the simple sound of silence. He might long for the gentle rustle of unburdened fabric, the soft whisper of a normal bed, the quiet creak of floorboards that don't sound like a siege engine. But no, his reality was a relentless symphony of steel, a clanking serenade composed of his own discomfort. It was a sound that would become intrinsically linked with sleeplessness, with the crushing weight and the maddening confinement. The very sound of his protection became an instrument of his torture, ensuring that even if his body somehow managed to find a fleeting moment of shallow rest, his mind would be perpetually on edge, listening, waiting for the next metallic groan, the next clanging declaration of the armor's enduring presence. The clanking lullaby was a stark reminder. In this metallic world, peace was an unattainable luxury. Chapter 5. Sweat and steel we have, with a certain morbid fascination, meticulously catalogued the myriad afflictions imposed upon a knight audacious enough to attempt slumber in his formidable, yet profoundly unsleep-friendly suit of armor. The sheer gravitational oppression, the claustrophobic embrace, the lurking dread of rust, and the relentlessly percussive clatter that accompanied every futile shift, these are but facets of a multifaceted nightmare. Now, dear listener, prepare yourself for perhaps the most viscerally uncomfortable aspect of this metallic prison, the infernal microclimate within, a suffocating realm of sweat and steel. Imagine, if you will, the knight having resigned himself to a night encased in his formidable shell, perhaps on a damp, chilly battleground, or even within the supposedly safer confines of a drafty tent. Beneath that gleaming exterior of articulated plates, he wore not merely a thin shift, but layers upon layers of practical, if entirely unbreathable, attire. First, typically, a linen shirt, then a padded gambeson, a thick quilted garment designed to absorb impacts and distribute the force of blows. Over this might be a mail coif and shirt, another layer of heavy woven steel rings, and only then the plate armor itself, a meticulously crafted, full-body enclosure of steel. Each layer, independently, served a vital protective purpose. Cumulatively, They created an insulating system of unparalleled efficiency, trapping warmth with the same dedication that it repelled sharp objects. The moment the armor was donned, a peculiar, self-contained environment began to form. Your body, a remarkable engine, constantly generates heat, even at rest. In an ordinary bed, this heat dissipates into the surrounding air. But within the confines of a full suit of armor, especially one laid horizontally, there was nowhere for that heat to go. The gambeson, designed to cushion and protect, became a highly effective thermal blanket. The steel plates, magnificent conductors of heat, both in and out, eventually, served to trap the rising warmth of the knight's body, creating a personal, mobile oven. Even on a cool night, the temperature inside would begin to climb steadily, transforming the relatively benign ambient air into a stifling, humid inferno. It was akin to attempting to sleep inside a very heavy, unventilated sleeping bag, one meticulously crafted from cast iron. The body's natural response to overheating, of course, is to sweat. And sweat, the knight would, copiously, profusely. Not a gentle, dewy sheen, but a veritable deluge. Every pore would open in a desperate attempt to cool the core temperature, and the sweat, having nowhere to evaporate, would simply accumulate. It would trickle down his back, a cold, clammy river carving paths through the hair and past the folds of skin. It would pool in the small of his back, a warm, unpleasant puddle beneath the unyielding steel. It would gather in the creases of his elbows and knees, creating sticky, uncomfortable reservoirs. His gambeson, once a relatively dry and supportive garment, would quickly become saturated, clinging to his skin like a damp, oppressive second skin. The soft, absorbent fabric would, in this context, transform into a sponge, holding on to every drop of moisture, ensuring that the sensation of being perpetually damp, clammy, and utterly uncomfortable was constant. Imagine, if you will, the profound indignity of this. You've had night sweats, perhaps, a moment of waking to find your sheets slightly damp, a minor irritation quickly resolved by throwing off a blanket. Now, envision that feeling magnified by 1,000 and entirely inescapable. You are encased in steel, your very skin glistening with the products of your own thermoregulation, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. You cannot kick off a blanket, you cannot seek a cool spot on the bed, you cannot even shift significantly to allow a fresh breath of air to reach your skin. The air within the armor, already stale from limited ventilation, would quickly become thick and heavy with humidity, a warm, soupy miasma that made each breath feel less refreshing and more like inhaling someone else's exhaled, damp air. And then there are the less obvious, but equally insidious, consequences. The combination of sweat, heat, and the constant, subtle friction of the gambeson against the skin, and the gambeson against the steel, was a recipe for chafing. Raw, irritated patches of skin would inevitably develop, especially in sensitive areas like the inner thighs, the armpits, and around the collar. Each tiny shift of the body, each subconscious twitch, would rub the damp, irritated skin against the rough fabric or the unforgiving edge of a steel plate, turning mild discomfort into a searing, persistent agony. An itch, the primal, maddening itch that is easily scratched in civilian life, becomes an unassailable torment when encased in layers of padding and steel. The desperate urge to reach that one unreachable spot, the maddening sensation of something crawling on your skin, amplified by the inability to even move a finger to investigate it, was a form of refined torture. The smell, too, would become a profound factor in this nocturnal misery. The metallic tang of steel, mixed with the musky aroma of stale sweat, the faint scent of leather and oil, and the indefinable odor of a human body, slowly simmering in its own juices, it would all combine into a unique and profoundly unpleasant olfactory bouquet. Confined within the helmet, if it remained on, this smell would be concentrated, omnipresent, a constant reminder of the night's self-imposed, sweaty confinement. Breathing in this stagnant, warm and highly personalized air, hour after agonizing hour, would only add to the sense of claustrophobia and the profound desire for escape. The psychological impact of this constant oppressive heat and dampness cannot be understated. Sleep is meant to be restorative, a cleansing of the day's physical and mental burdens. But for the night, his rest was anything but. His body would be in a perpetual state of attempting to cool itself, a futile battle against the very materials meant to protect him. This internal struggle would prevent any deep, restorative sleep. He would be restless, tossing and turning, or rather, attempting to toss and turn with the grace of a beached whale, plagued by a feverish, agitated state that blurred the lines between waking misery and nightmare. Dreams, if they came, might be vivid, uncomfortable visions of suffocating under blankets of lead, or being boiled alive in a metallic pot. Even if the ambient temperature outside was cool, the internal environment of the armor would remain stubbornly hot and humid. And if the knight were unfortunate enough to be sleeping in armor during a warm period, or worse, in direct sunlight during a daytime vigil, the conditions would quickly become life-threatening. Heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion would become very real and immediate concerns. It transforms the armor from a symbol of protection into a deliberate instrument of physiological distress, a perverse twist of engineering, where the very design meant to save a life now threatened its restful cessation. So as the night wore on, the knight would lie there, a prisoner in his own gleaming shell, bathed in his own accumulated moisture. The cool kiss of dawn, if it ever arrived, would bring not relief, but merely the end of one form of suffering and the commencement of another. The arduous process of extracting himself from the sweaty, clinging layers, and the immediate, urgent need for air, for cleanliness, for a brief respite from the cloying embrace of his metallic second skin. The heat, the sweat, the humidity, they were the invisible tormentors within the steel, ensuring that even if external threats were momentarily absent, the knight's body waged its own internal, sleepless battle against the very essence of comfort and repose. This truly was the peculiar torment of sweat and steel. Chapter 6. Midnight Itch Crisis. We have, by now, painted a rather vivid, if entirely uncomfortable, portrait of the knight's nocturnal woes while encased in his gleaming, yet profoundly inconvenient suit of armor. We have grappled with the crushing gravitational weight that defies all notions of repose, contended with the suffocating embrace of the steel that renders natural movement a distant memory, wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, and endured the relentless, clanking symphony that accompanies every futile attempt at shifting. We have even sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transforms the night's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. And now, dear listener, we arrive at perhaps the most exquisitely infuriating of all these torments, one so fundamentally primal and maddening that it could, on its own, drive even the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy, the unscratchable itch. Imagine, if you will, the knight lying stiffly on his back, perhaps on a thin straw-filled pallet in a drafty tent, or worse, directly on the damp earth of a battlefield. His body is already a landscape of complaints. A hip aches from the pressure of the cuisse, a shoulder throbs where the pauldron digs in. His breathing is shallow against the weight of the cuirass, and a thin, persistent sheen of sweat coats his skin beneath the thick, multi-layered gambeson. He has perhaps just managed to coax his mind to the very precipice of unconsciousness, a fragile state where the metallic creaks and groans of his armor begin to fade into a dull background hum. And then it begins. It starts innocuously enough, a mere whisper of irritation, a faint prickle, perhaps on the small of his back, or the inside of his elbow, or even, oh, the exquisite torment, directly beneath the chin strap of his helm. It is a sensation so utterly trivial in normal circumstances, a fleeting annoyance easily dismissed with a casual rub or a quick scratch. But here, within the unyielding confines of steel and padding, it transforms. That gentle prickle blossoms, expanding its tendrils, intensifying with each second of its unaddressed presence. It is no longer just a prickle. It becomes a crawl, a burn, a maddening tickle that screams for immediate attention, a tiny, insistent voice in the vast silence of the night's metallic prison. The futility is immediate and absolute. His hands, encased in the rigid gauntlets, are as useless as iron clubs for the delicate, precise act of scratching. The individual limbs, designed to provide articulation for gripping a sword or wielding a lance, conspire against him now, locking his fingers into a semi-permanent, unyielding pose. He tries to curl a finger, to bend a thumb, to even just twitch his hand in a way that might offer some meager friction, but the steel is uncompromised. It is a solid, impenetrable barrier between his tormented skin and the desperate yearning for relief. His own hands, instruments of war and feats of strength, are rendered utterly impotent in the face of a microscopic epidermal rebellion. The irony is bitter, a truly dark jest played out by the very gear meant to empower him. The itch, meanwhile, intensifies, a malevolent entity feeding on his helplessness. It begins to move, or so it feels, darting across his skin, 100 tiny pinpricks of pure, unadulterated frustration. He tries to contort his body, to twist, to squirm, to rub the affected area against the thick, padded gambeson, or, in a moment of utter desperation, even against the unyielding steel plate itself. But the armor, as we have thoroughly established, is a straitjacket of the most advanced medieval design. His torso is locked by the cuirass, his arms fixed by the vambraces, his legs held rigid by the greaves. The slightest attempt at a significant shift is met with a cacophony of metallic groans and clanks, a symphony of complaint from the armor itself, mocking his efforts, reminding him of his utter immobility. He might try to arch his back, straining against the confines, only to find the unyielding backplate digging in further, offering not relief, but a new, deeper layer of discomfort. He might attempt to draw a knee towards his chest, to rub an itching calf, but the pollens and quisses forbid it, holding his leg in a straight, inflexible line. And the locations. Oh, the strategically chosen locations of these infernal torments. It might be the very center of his back, just between his shoulder blades, a spot that, even unarmored, often requires a contortionist's grace or the aid of a friendly wall to reach. Here, it is not merely unreachable. It is a fortress, guarded by layers of fabric and solid steel. Or perhaps it is his nose, a tickle right at the tip, or an aggravating dryness just inside a nostril. The helmet, with its restrictive vision slits and lack of a functional nose-scratching aperture, transforms this simple human reflex into an impossible dream. He might try to rub his entire helmet against the ground, or rock his head, a grotesque pantomime of desperate relief, only to find the sensation unchanged, or worse, amplified by the sheer futility. The psychological toll is immense. An itch, once it cannot be scratched, morphs from a minor physical sensation into a full-blown mental obsession. The mind, desperate for relief, fixates on it. Every thought becomes filtered through the lens of that incessant irritation. He might try to distract himself, to focus on the sounds of the night, or the strategy for tomorrow's battle, or even the dull ache in his joints. But the itch persists, a tiny, relentless drill bit burrowing into his sanity. It grows, demanding attention, screaming its presence, until it becomes the singular, all-consuming reality of his existence in that moment. The inability to respond to such a fundamental bodily urge is a profound violation of self, a constant reminder of his imprisonment. He might find himself engaging in increasingly bizarre and futile attempts at relief, pressing his face firmly against the inside of his helmet, hoping the friction of the padding might transfer through, flexing every muscle in his body, as if a generalized muscle contraction could somehow dislodge the torment. Even perhaps grinding his teeth, a desperate unconscious attempt to redirect the sensory input, to drown out the maddening signal from his skin with the grinding of enamel. None of it works. The itch remains a defiant, microscopic tyrant. Sleep, already a fleeting phantom under these conditions, becomes utterly impossible. How can one drift into slumber when 1,000 invisible insects are crawling, biting, and tickling at every unreachable point on one's body? The mind, instead of quieting, becomes a frantic battlefield, consumed by the single, overriding directive: scratch. And the body, locked in its metallic shell, can only twitch, strain, and writhe in silent, impotent rage. The deeper the itch, the more desperate the attempts, the more pronounced the metallic symphony of clanks and groans that echoes through the night, rousing anyone nearby and undoubtedly confirming to them that the night, once again, was having a truly terrible, no good, very bad night. The despair would be palpable, a heavy cloak weighing down an already beleaguered spirit. To be a mighty warrior, capable of felling foes with a single blow, yet utterly defeated by a minute epidermal irritation. To yearn for the simple freedom of a finger, to be able to reach that maddening spot, just for a second, to rub, to scratch, to find that moment of blessed, glorious relief. But no. The armor, his protector, his symbol, was now his torturer, keeping relief just out of reach. A cruel, metallic joke at the expense of his sanity. The itch would become a central character in his restless night, a persistent, mocking voice in the darkness, ensuring that even if external threats were momentarily absent, his own skin would wage a relentless internal war against his peace of mind. He might wake up in the morning, not from the alarm of a bugle, but from the sheer accumulated agony of an unscratchable itch that had plagued him through the long, dark hours, leaving him more exhausted than when he lay down. It was truly, utterly, and most hilariously in retrospect, a midnight itch crisis from which there was no escape, save the eventual, glorious, and likely painful disrobing. Chapter 7. The Helmet's Echo. We have navigated the treacherous landscape of the night's nocturnal torment, charting his journey through the crushing weight, the claustrophobic embrace, the gnawing anxiety of rust, the incessant clanking symphony, and the stifling, humid microclimate that transformed his magnificent armor into a mobile. We have even commiserated over the truly exquisite agony of the unscratchable itch, a torment so petty, yet so profoundly maddening. But now, dear listener, as the night lies prone, encased in his steely cocoon, let us direct our attention to the final, most intimate, and perhaps most psychologically unsettling layer of his misery: the auditory landscape within his own helmet. The helmet, that crowning glory of medieval defensive engineering, was a formidable piece designed to protect the most vulnerable part of the human anatomy. It deflected blows, absorbed impacts, and presented a terrifying, unyielding visage to the enemy. But for the knight attempting to snatch a few precious moments of sleep, especially if circumstances demanded he keep it on, it transformed into an acoustic chamber of profound and unsettling properties, a personal sound box where every internal biological function was amplified, distorted and mercilessly thrown back at his own ears, like a dungeon's echo mocking his attempts at peace. Imagine the absolute stillness of a cold, moonlit night on campaign. Outside the helmet there might be the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rustle of leaves, or the soft patter of dew on canvas. But inside, for the weary night, there was no such tranquility. The immediate, omnipresent sound would be his own breath. In an ordinary bed, breathing is a subconscious rhythmic whisper, a gentle rise and fall that can even lull one to sleep. Within the confines of a steel helm, however, especially one with limited ventilation, each inhalation became a distinct whoosh, a rushing intake of stale, warm air that echoed and reverberated. Each exhalation, a sibilant hiss, a private sigh of effort that seemed disproportionately loud. It was as if his very lungs were enormous bellows, furiously pumping air in and out. The sound amplified and distorted until it became an intrusive, inescapable roar. His breath was no longer a comforting rhythm. It was a constant, almost panicked, declaration of his own restricted existence. The air itself grew thick, heavy with the recycled carbon dioxide and the metallic tang of the steel, making each amplified breath feel less refreshing and more like a desperate rebreathing of his own confinement. Then there was the heartbeat, that steady, reassuring thump-thumpum that quietly powers the body. In the quiet of a normal night, it can be a soothing pulse. But within the resonance chamber of a steel helmet, pressed close to his head, it morphed into a relentless, insistent bi-thrum, a deep, booming percussion that vibrated through the very metal itself. It was the sound of a trapped drum, relentlessly beating out the rhythm of his wakefulness, a powerful, unceasing reminder of his racing thoughts and elevated discomfort. He could feel it in his temples, a dull physical ache accompanying the amplified sound, a constant, low-frequency hum that prevented any mental quietude. This wasn't merely hearing his heartbeat. It was experiencing it as a full-body vibration, a visceral, inescapable presence. And what about the less polite, yet entirely natural, bodily functions? The stomach, often protesting a meager, cold campaign meal, would produce a symphony of gurgles, rumbles, and squelches. In the open air, these are usually dismissed as minor internal disturbances. Inside the helmet, however, they became monstrous guttural roars, the sounds of some unseen beast churning within his very core. A subtle shift of internal fluids, a natural contraction of muscle in the digestive tract, would sound like a miniature earthquake, a monstrous squelching and bubbling that was both disgusting and profoundly distracting. Each internal churn would reverberate, amplified and distorted, turning his own digestive processes into a grotesque, echoing soundscape that would keep him awake with a combination of morbid fascination and sheer irritation. It was a humiliating private concert of bodily functions performed for an audience of one, trapped in a metallic shell. A simple sigh, a commonplace expression of weariness or exasperation, transformed within the helmet into a deep, booming exhalation, a sound so amplified and mournful that it might startle the knight himself. It was no longer a quiet sigh of despair. It was a cavernous moan, echoing and re-echoing, as if he were trapped in a vast, empty dungeon, the sound bouncing off unseen walls. Only those walls were mere inches from his ears. And a cough. Oh, a cough would be a truly spectacular event. What normally might be a brief, sharp expulsion of air would, inside the helmet, become a percussive explosion, a loud rattling death-whacking that would ring through his skull, shaking his very teeth. The residual rasping in his throat, the clearing of phlegm, would be magnified into a wet, unsettling rasp, a sound that would send shivers down his own spine. He would feel the vibrations of it in the metal, a physical jolt accompanying the jarring sound, ensuring that any nascent attempt at sleep was utterly shattered. And the snore. If, by some act of divine intervention or sheer, desperate exhaustion, the knight did manage to slip into a shallow, fitful sleep, the snore, that most common and often irritating nocturnal vocalization, would become a profound self-sabotage. In the absence of an open chamber for sound to dissipate, his own snore, be it a gentle rumble or a full-throated roar, would be immediately reflected back at him, amplified to an almost unbearable degree. It would be akin to sleeping with a very loud, very persistent air horn directly beside one's ear, only the air horn is produced by your own collapsing airways, and you cannot escape it. Each snort, each rattling breath, would be a jarring explosion of sound, waking him with a jolt, filling him with a fresh wave of self-inflicted auditory torture. He would be trapped in a nightmare of his own making, roused repeatedly by the booming echoes of his own involuntary sleep sounds. The cycle would be endless. Exhaustion leading to a brief, shallow doze, followed by an amplified snore, leading to a sudden, jarring awakening, only to restart the process. The claustrophobia, already a significant player in the night's discomfort, was profoundly exacerbated by this auditory confinement. His world was not merely physically small. It was acoustically small, dominated by the raw, unvarnished sounds of his own body, stripped of any external distractions. There was no escape, no turning away from the source of the noise. It was him, and only him, trapped in a metallic echo chamber. The lack of fresh air, the warmth, the feeling of the metal pressing on his head all contributed to a disorienting, isolating experience. The muffled external world only served to highlight the amplified internal one, creating a perverse sensory paradox. Furthermore, the materials themselves contributed to this symphony of self-torture. The leather padding inside the helmet, designed for comfort and fit, would absorb some sound, but also vibrate, adding a dull, resonant quality to the echoes. The metal itself, cold and unyielding, would reflect sound waves with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that every tremor, every sigh, every cough, every snort was given its full, unadulterated auditory due. It was a constant grating reminder of his metallic prison, a permanent soundtrack to his misery. The mind, starved of true rest, would become hyper-aware of these sounds, amplifying them further through sheer focus, turning minor biological functions into overwhelming, inescapable sensory events. So, as the knight lay there, battered by the weight of his armor, sweating profusely, battling phantom itches, and enduring the constant clatter of his own movements, the helmet added the final cruel flourish, a private, unrelenting concert of his own bodily functions, magnified and distorted beyond all reason. His breath, a roar. His heartbeat, a drum. His stomach, a churning beast. His coughs, explosions. And his snores, an inescapable chorus of self-destruction. Sleep, that elusive dream, would forever remain just out of reach, shattered by the constant reverberation of his own internal world, trapped within the resonant, mocking echo chamber of his steel helm. The helmet, while protecting his brain from external foes, seemed intent on driving his mind to distraction with the relentless, unyielding symphony of his own being. It was truly, utterly, and perpetually the helmet's echo, a sleepless soundtrack to a night of metallic torment. Chapter 8. Dreams of Mobility. We have journeyed through the tangible miseries of a knight attempting to find solace in slumber while encased in his formidable steel shell. The unrelenting downward pull of gravity, the suffocating embrace of unyielding metal, the nagging, insidious dread of rust, the incessant clanking chorus that accompanied every futile adjustment, and the inescapable humid microclimate that trapped. We have even explored the exquisite, maddening agony of the unscratchable itch, a torment so minor in civilian life, yet so profoundly maddening within the confines of plate. Now, dear listener, as the knight lies prone and restless, his mind, starved of true peace, descends into the surreal, frustrating landscape of his dreams. A realm where the yearning for simple mobility blends seamlessly with the dark, fantastical echoes of his waking torment. It is important to understand that the sleep afforded to a knight in full armor was rarely, if ever, deep and restorative. It was a shallow, fragmented affair, a mere skim across the surface of unconsciousness, perpetually on the verge of being shattered by a pressure point, a clank, an itch, or the amplified echo of his own breath. Such sleep, fragile and disturbed, is fertile ground for vivid, often unsettling dreams, where the anxieties and physical discomforts of waking life are twisted into bizarre, personalized narratives. For the knight whose waking hours were defined by the rigid constraints of his profession and his protective gear, these dreams often became a cruel, ironic theater of impossible movement. The dream might begin, deceptively, with a glorious, unburdened lightness. The knight, perhaps a grizzled veteran of many campaigns, finds himself suddenly free. He is running, not with the heavy, measured stride of an armored man, but with the effortless grace of a stag across an open field. His lungs fill with cool, crisp air. His limbs pump without protest, his feet barely touching the ground. He leaps over a fallen log with an impossible agility, spins on his heel, perhaps even feels the exhilarating rush of flight, soaring above the very battlefields that confined him. The wind whips through his hair, a sensation long forgotten beneath the weight of his helm. He can stretch, truly stretch, his arms reaching for the sky, his back arching with a glorious, unimpeded flexibility. There is a profound, almost tearful joy in this unencumbered motion, a primal relief that washes over his dream self, a stark contrast to the metallic prison that defines his waking reality. For a brief, blissful moment, he is pure, untethered movement. But then, insidiously, the dream begins to warp. A subtle resistance appears. Perhaps his stride shortens imperceptibly, or a faint metallic whisper accompanies a swing of his arm. The ground beneath him, once soft and yielding, feels firmer, as if studded with pebbles of lead. He tries to leap again, but his feet drag, heavy and recalcitrant. The wind, which once caressed his dream face, now feels thick like water. The lightness fades, replaced by a growing, sickening sense of drag. The armor, his waking tormentor, begins its spectral intrusion. A faint glint of steel appears on his arm, then a patch of dull gray on his leg. Slowly, agonizingly, the dream body begins to harden, to coalesce into the familiar, oppressive form of his panoply. He tries to run faster, to outpace the encroaching transformation, but his dream legs grow stiff, the cuisses locking, the greaves turning his shins into unyielding pillars. The effortless sprint becomes a laborious, slow-motion trudge, each step a struggle against invisible chains. He hears it now, the metallic symphony of his waking nightmare, the faint creak of the pauldrons, the groan of the cuirass, the dull clunking of sabatons. The wind, once a balm, now whistles through his eye slits, cold and mocking. The dream shifts into scenarios of impossible, soul-crushing futility. He finds himself standing at the edge of a vast, emerald lake, yearning to dive in, to feel the cool embrace of the water. He steps forward, but the moment he enters the water, the dream armor becomes a colossal weight, pulling him down with an inexorable force. He sinks, slowly, helplessly, bubbles escaping his sealed helmet, watching the surface recede, unable to swim, unable to float, a metallic anchor dragging him to the abyssal depth. Or perhaps he is at a grand feast, a joyous celebration where others dance with abandon, twirling and leaping to the music of lutes and pipes. He tries to join them, his heart aching for the simple pleasure of a jig, but his armored form is a rigid, clanking monument to immobility. His limbs refuse to bend naturally, his feet cannot pivot, and every awkward attempt at a step is met with a jarring clanging and a scrape, drawing unwanted, pitying glances. He is a statue at a ball, forever condemned to stillness amidst joyous motion. The itch, that maddening, unscratchable torment, also finds its way into the dreamscape, magnified and malevolent. He feels 1,000 invisible insects crawling beneath his dream gambeson, their tiny legs prickling his skin from neck to ankle. He raises a dream hand, but it is a rigid gauntlet, useless. He tries to twist, to writhe, to rub against a rough surface, but the armor holds him fast, turning his body into an unyielding, unfeeling block of steel. The more he strains, the more intense the itch becomes, until it is a fiery, all-consuming agony, a silent scream of frustration that echoes through his dream mind. The inability to scratch becomes the singular, horrific focus of his night, a tiny, petty tyranny that trumps all other terrors. Sometimes the dream takes a more overtly fantastical turn, blending the historical burden with the dark psychological landscape. He might find himself in a vast empty hall, his armor suddenly alive, its plates tightening, its joints seizing, the very metal whispering ancient, malevolent secrets to him through the helm. The armor becomes less a suit and more part of him, an iron skin that grows heavier, colder, slowly fusing him to the ground, rooting him in place until he is nothing more than a rusted, immovable sentinel. He tries to speak, but his voice is muffled, lost within the metallic echo chamber. He tries to scream, but only a hollow clanking escapes. He is a prisoner within his own protection, a living monument to his own immobility. The pursuit dream, a common anxiety, becomes particularly cruel for the armored knight. He is being hunted by some unseen, nameless horror, or perhaps a horde of terrifying, impossibly agile foes. He tries to run, his legs pumping with desperate urgency, but each step is agonizingly slow, as if he is wading through thick mud. The weight of his armor triples, quadruples, becoming an insurmountable burden. His pursuers, light and quick, gain on him relentlessly, their whispers growing louder, their shadows lengthening, while he, the mighty knight, can only lumber forward with the grace of a collapsing stone wall, utterly helpless to escape his own leaden feet. He wakes with a gasp, his heart pounding, only to find the very real weight of his cuirass pressing on his chest. A stark and immediate reminder that the dream was, in essence, a brutal mirror of his waking reality. The clanking, ever present in his waking attempts at rest, manifests in the dreams not as a mere sound, but as a physical presence. Each shift, each attempt at movement, creates an excruciatingly loud, grating shriek of metal, magnified and distorted, filling the dream world with a cacophony that prevents any sense of peace. It's the sound of his own entrapment, a perpetual soundtrack to his powerlessness. The helmet, if it remains in the dream, becomes a heavy, dark void, amplifying his own labored breath and the frantic thrum of his heart, creating a sensory deprivation chamber within the dream itself, further isolating him in his frustration. And then, just as the dream reaches its crescendo of helpless immobility and maddening frustration, the knight jolts awake. The cold reality of his physical confinement rushes back, but it is now overlaid with the lingering, bitter taste of his dream's futility. His limbs are still stiff, his back aches, his head is still encased, and the phantom itch persists, now more maddening than ever. The dreams of effortless movement, so tantalizingly real for a few moments, have only served to highlight the profound, inescapable misery of his actual situation. He is more exhausted than before, his mind battered by the psychological torment of his subconscious, the very act of dreaming becoming another front in his endless, sleepless war against his own armor. The longing for freedom, denied in waking life, pursued and then cruelly withdrawn in sleep, leaves him with a profound sense of despair. He lies there, a prisoner in steel, forever haunted by the fleeting, tantalizing visions of a mobility he cannot possess, even in the deepest recesses of his own mind. Chapter 9. The Servant's Dilemma. We have, with perhaps a touch of grim fascination, dissected the knight's personal hell. The crushing weight, The claustrophobic confines, the insidious whisper of rust, the jarring clatter of every shift, the pervasive, humid sweatbox within his steel shell, and the truly maddening, unscratchable. We have even delved into the surreal, frustrated landscape of his dreams, where the simple act of movement became a tantalizing, then cruelly withdrawn illusion. But the night, for all his self-inflicted nocturnal misery, was rarely an island unto himself. Indeed, his very existence, and certainly his ability to don or doff that magnificent, yet utterly impractical suit of armor, hinged entirely upon the often unsung, perpetually weary, and profoundly put upon figure of his squire. This, dear listener, is the tale of their predicament, the silent burden carried by those tasked with assisting a man who, by choice or cruel circumstance, had spent a night attempting to sleep in a glorified metal coffin. Imagine the dawn after such a night. The first sliver of gray light might pierce the canvas of a tent, or filter through the grimy windows of a makeshift campaign headquarters. For the squire, it marked not the promise of a fresh start, but the inevitable commencement of his most strenuous and thankless duties. He would approach his master, the knight, who would be lying there, a rigid steel-clad mound, a testament to discomfort and a profound lack of sleep. The knight would be stiff, every muscle screaming in protest, his eyes likely bloodshot and narrowed from the previous hours of unremitting torment. The air around him, if he was in a tent, would be thick with a peculiar odor of stale sweat, cold steel, and perhaps a faint unsettling tang of anxiety. Squire, a young man often no older than a teenager, striving for his own knighthood, would have to suppress any nascent sympathy for his lord's predicament, knowing full well that a grumpy, sleep-deprived knight was a formidable force of nature, albeit one encased in immobile steel. The process of disrobing, even for a knight who had merely sat upright for a prolonged vigil, was a meticulous, multi-stage operation requiring both strength and dexterity. For a knight who had actually attempted to lie down in armor, it was a contortionist's nightmare, a feat of mechanical disassembly performed on a grumbling, aching human being. The squire would first have to navigate the numerous straps and buckles. These were not simple fasteners. They were robust leather, often stiffened with age and use, designed to hold dozens of pounds of steel firmly in place. Each buckle would need to be unfastened, each strap unthreaded, each point of connection patiently released. And there were so many of them. Straps for the pauldrons, straps for the vambraces, straps connecting the breastplate to the backplate, straps for the cuisses, the greaves, sabatons. It was a veritable labyrinth of leather and metal, and any misstep, any fumbling, could result in a painful pinch for the knight, or a frustrated growl from the squire. The helmet, often the first piece removed in any non-combat situation, would be carefully lifted away, allowing the knight his first true breath of fresh, unfiltered air in hours. The squire might note the sheen of sweat on his master's brow, the pallor of his skin, and perhaps a faint, lingering indentation where the padding had pressed against his face. Then came the gorget, the neck guard, unbuckled and carefully lifted, followed by the formidable breastplate and backplate. This was a moment requiring particular care. The cuirass, often the heaviest single piece, could weigh 20 pounds or more. As it was unbuckled, the squire would need to support its weight, guiding it away from the knight's aching torso, careful not to scrape against the gambeson or snag on any underlying mail. The knight, stiff from his attempted slumber, might struggle to cooperate, his movements jerky, his limbs less compliant than usual. The squire would have to maneuver the heavy steel, often straining his own young back, while simultaneously trying to avoid eliciting further groans of discomfort from his lord. Then came the limbs. Each vambrace, each cuisse, each greave, would need to be unstrapped and carefully slid off. The mail coif and shirt, if worn, would then need to be peeled away, a heavy chain-link shroud that would cling to the sweat-soaked gambeson beneath. The gambeson itself, that thick, quilted underarmor, would be damp, perhaps even saturated, from the knight's prodigious night sweats. Removing it was akin to peeling off a particularly stubborn, clammy second skin. The squire, with sardonic sympathy, would have to pull and tug, feeling the clinging dampness against his own hands, and perhaps inhaling the distinct, ripe aroma of long-stewed nightly perspiration. It was a less than glamorous task, a stark contrast to the noble image of mounted combat. Throughout this arduous disrobing, the knight, predictably, would be a fount of complaints. His joints, locked rigid for hours, would pop and creak as they were finally allowed to move. His muscles, cramped and stiff, would protest every attempted stretch. The phantom itch, unscratchable through the long night, would now manifest as a desperate, unyielding demand. My back, boy, higher. There, no, to the left, just there, gods, the torment. The squire, armed only with a thick, unyielding padded glove, would attempt to scratch through the gambeson, knowing full well it would offer little relief. He might be dispatched to fetch water, or a salve for chafed skin, or perhaps a strong ale to dull the edge of his master's misery. His own patience, a valuable commodity, would be tested daily by the sheer petulance of a man who had chosen to sleep in a literal tin can. Once the armor was finally off, the knight would be a damp, red, and deeply relieved figure. But for the squire, the work had only just begun. The armor, now lying in its component pieces, presented its own set of demands. Each plate, still warm from the night's body heat, would need immediate attention. Rust, that ever-present specter, was a constant threat. Any moisture, especially the acidic sweat of a human body, was an open invitation for corrosion. The squire would have to painstakingly wipe down every surface, inspecting for the telltale orange bloom. Then came the oiling, the careful application of linseed or another protective oil rubbed into every surface to create a barrier against the elements. The hinges and articulations, particularly those that had clanked and groaned through the night, would need fresh grease or wax, meticulously worked into every joint to ensure smooth, silent movement for the next day's battles. Minor dents or scrapes might need to be gently hammered out, loose rivets tightened, and frayed straps repaired. This was a daily ritual, often consuming hours, performed with the diligence of a monk and the physical exertion of a blacksmith's apprentice. The knight might then retire to his relatively comfortable, unarmored sleep, or perhaps partake in a meager breakfast, while his squire labored, his hands stained with oil and grime, his mind already calculating the hours until the armor would need to be donned again. Because, of course, the process of putting the armor on was just as arduous, albeit usually performed under the less immediate duress of waking hours. Each piece had to be carefully fitted, each strap tightened with precision, ensuring a balance that allowed for maximum mobility in combat. The squire would guide the knight's limbs, help him adjust the weight, ensure no pinch points, and then, finally secure the helm, effectively sealing his master once more into his shining, formidable, and entirely uncomfortable shell. The servant's dilemma then was this. His lord's protection and effectiveness, and by extension his own future, depended entirely on the meticulous care and skilled assistance he provided. Yet the very nature of that protection guaranteed a certain level of physical and emotional strain for both parties. The squire, often sleeping on a harder bed than his master, with less food and more demands, could only look on with sardonic sympathy at the sleep-deprived, grumbling knight emerging from his steel shell. He was the unsung hero, the silent enabler of chivalric absurdity, a humble cog in a very heavy, very clanky, and ultimately very impractical machine. His knight, though perhaps also uncomfortable, was at least free from the intimate amplified echoes of his own bodily functions and the maddening futility of an unscratchable itch. He knew with a certainty born of endless experience that trying to sleep in a suit of armor was, as his master's grumpy demeanor so eloquently attested, a monumentally terrible idea. And he, the squire, was the one who had to clean up after it. Chapter 10. Armor as a nightmare. We have, by this point, meticulously chronicled the manifold agonies that afflicted a medieval knight so unwise, or so desperate as to attempt slumber within the gleaming confines of his plate armor. We have, with a certain dry amusement, depicted the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, the claustrophobic embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a night's most prized possession. We have endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the night's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We have even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. And in his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. Given this litany of discomfort, this veritable catalogue of misery, one might reasonably ask, why? Why would any sane individual willingly subject themselves to such a profound and utterly relentless ordeal? Why would a knight whose days were already filled with the heavy burdens of war and the constant threat of violent death choose to compound his suffering with a night spent in what amounts to a beautifully crafted, but utterly impractical, torture device? The answer, dear listener, is not a testament to stoicism or an adherence to some bizarre ascetic ritual. The answer is far more primal, far more chilling, and ultimately far more tragic. Fear. The fear of nighttime attacks, of being caught unprepared, of a swift, brutal end delivered by an unseen enemy in the dark. For some nights, in certain desperate circumstances, the physical torment of sleeping in armor was a perceived lesser evil, a grim bargain struck against the greater terror of vulnerability. Imagine the precarious existence of a knight on campaign, far from the relative safety of a fortified castle or a well-guarded town. The medieval world was a landscape riddled with peril. Ambushes were commonplace, bandits roamed the roads, and rival lords or raiding parties might strike without warning, especially under the concealing shroud of night. A siege, a prolonged grinding affair, demanded constant vigilance, for an assault could come at any hour, under the cover of darkness or a sudden, thick fog. Picket duty, guarding a vital pass or a vulnerable flank, meant that one's life, and the lives of those behind him, depended on instantaneous readiness. In such a world, the concept of a truly peaceful, unburdened sleep was often a luxury, a fantasy indulged only in the most secure of locations. The donning of a full suit of plate armor, even with the skilled assistance of one or more squires, was not a swift affair. We are not talking about pulling on a jacket. This was a complex multi-stage process involving numerous straps, buckles, and interlocking plates. Even for a practiced team, it could take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes to go from a state of undress to fully encased and ready for combat. 15 minutes. In the context of a sudden, brutal night raid, that was an eternity. That was the difference between life and death. That was the difference between seizing your sword and standing as a fighting man, or being cut down in your sleeping silks, a helpless, unarmored target. The perceived necessity, therefore, of being able to spring from a horizontal position to a combat-ready stance in mere seconds, or at most a minute or two, compelled some knights to make this dreadful choice. They would remove the helm, perhaps, and loosen a few straps for some meager comfort, but the bulk of the armor, the vital cuirass, the leg and arm defenses, would remain. This choice transformed the armor from a symbol of protection into a literal waking nightmare, extending its reach into the realm of sleep. The knight, lying there, felt the weight of the steel not just as physical pressure, but as a heavy, cold blanket of dread. Every slight sound outside his tent, every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a twig would be interpreted through the lens of heightened anxiety. Was it the wind? Or was it the stealthy approach of an enemy patrol? His mind, already tormented by physical discomfort, would remain in a state of hypervigilance, perpetually scanning for threats, unable to truly switch off. The sounds of his own clanking armor, which we previously discussed as a maddening nuisance, would now take on a perverse significance, acting as a crude but ever-present alarm system. Any shift, any involuntary twitch resulting in a clang would momentarily snap him to full attention, confirming his precarious state, forcing him to re-evaluate his surroundings. The irony here is exquisite and cruel. The very noisiness of his protection, which prevented deep sleep, also served as a constant reminder of his readiness, a double-edged sword of auditory torment and perceived security. The psychological toll of such a decision cannot be overstated. A knight who chose to sleep in armor did so not out of heroism, but out of a desperate, gnawing fear. This fear would manifest in his shallow dreams, even more so than the general frustrations of immobility. He might dream of being caught unarmored, of stumbling through the dark, trying frantically to don his pieces, while unseen enemies closed in. He would feel the terror of the cold steel on his skin, but this time it was the cold steel of an enemy's blade, not his own protective shell. He might dream of being too slow, of his movements hampered not by the weight of his own armor, but by an inexplicable leadenness in his limbs, a premonition of helplessness. The feeling of being exposed, of lacking the formidable shell that defined his identity and ensured his survival, would be a recurring nightmare, a terror far surpassing the physical aches and pains of his actual situation. He would awaken with a jolt, heart pounding, sweat trickling, only to find the familiar weight of his cuirass pressing down, a strange, paradoxical comfort, a confirmation that he was, at least, still protected. For the knight on siege duty, perched precariously on a rampart, or huddled in a ditch before a besieged wall, sleeping in armor was a grim necessity. He knew the enemy might attempt a scaling assault at any moment, a desperate sally from the gates or a sudden breach in the walls. To be caught in his bedclothes, unarmed and unarmored, would be a catastrophic failure. So, he would endure the pins and pokes, the sweat and the stiffness, the echoing sounds of his own labored breathing, knowing that this discomfort was the price of potential survival. His armor was not just a shield. It was a permanent, heavy reminder of the ever-present threat, a tangible manifestation of his constant state of wariness. Even when not actively under siege, a knight traveling through hostile or uncertain lands might choose this path. The small inns were often unsecured, the forests notorious for brigands. To shed his armor, to truly relax, was to invite disaster. So he would bed down, perhaps by a meager fire, his helmet off but placed close by, his other pieces remaining fastened, ensuring that any rustle, any distant cry could be met with an immediate, albeit clumsy, response. His sleep would be less sleep, and more a hyper-alert state of unconsciousness, a form of active sentry duty where his own body was the watchtower. The ultimate irony of armor as a nightmare is that the very solution to one profound fear, the fear of being vulnerable to attack, introduced a cascade of new, equally tormenting fears and physical miseries. The knight exchanged the dread of an external, violent death for the slow, grinding torment of internal, self-imposed suffering. He became a prisoner of his own protection, a sentinel perpetually at war with himself. His days were spent in combat, his nights in a different kind of battle, one fought against his own body, his mind, and the relentless, suffocating embrace of the steel he wore. The long-term consequences of such chronic sleep deprivation and physical stress would have been severe. Impaired judgment, irritability, increased susceptibility to illness, and a general erosion of mental fortitude. This was not a sustainable way of life, and it certainly wasn't a choice made lightly, but rather a desperate measure. A symbol of a world so dangerous that even sleep, that most basic human need, became another arena for suffering and vigilance. The armor, far from being a comforting shell, was a perpetual metallic nightmare, worn as a shield against an even greater, unspoken terror that never truly slept. Chapter 11. The morning after we have, by now, thoroughly dissected the medieval knight's rather unfortunate nocturnal preferences, or more accurately, the grim necessities that occasionally compelled him to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly uncomfortable, confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the claustrophobic embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat that creeping destroyer of a knight's most pride. We endured the relentless, cacophonous clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna base. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. And, in his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom, snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. Finally, we glimpsed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery. Now, dear listener, as the long, dreadful night reluctantly gives way to the first sliver of dawn, we arrive at the stark, stiff, and undeniably bruised reality that greeted our night a morning after that was anything but glorious. The first indication that the sun, or at least some form of pale, unforgiving light, had decided to grace the world, would not be a gentle warmth or the cheerful chirping of birds. For our armored knight, it would be a distinct shift in the quality of the air within his helm, a subtle change from the utter blackness to a muted, hazy gray through the eye slits, indicating that the world outside was no longer shrouded in perfect darkness. This wasn't a welcome awakening. It was more akin to the abrupt flick of a switch in a particularly uncomfortable room. His body, having spent untold hours in a rigid, horizontal position, cocooned in 50 to 70 pounds of unforgiving steel, would feel less like a human form and more like a discarded, extremely heavy marionette that had been left out in a damp field overnight. Every muscle fiber would scream in a chorus of protest. Each joint would feel as though it had been meticulously cemented into place, and his very skin would ache with a pervasive, deep-seated weariness that no amount of sleep, certainly not the fragmented, tortured kind he had just endured, could possibly alleviate. The first, monumental task of the morning was simply to move. Imagine, if you will, waking up after an ill-advised night, spent sleeping in an overly aggressive hammock, or perhaps on an unfamiliar sofa with a particularly unyielding armrest digging into your ribs, and then multiply that stiffness by a factor of several hundred. The knight, attempting to shift, would discover that his limbs, encased in their steel cocoons, had, during the few moments of shallow slumber, solidified into unbendable rods. His arms, encased in vambraces and gauntlets, would lie stiffly at his sides, or perhaps locked at a slight, awkward angle. Trying to bend an elbow or curl a finger would be met with a metallic groan from the armor and a sharp protest from his own stiff joints. The same applied to his legs. The greaves and cuisses would have held them in a perpetually extended position, turning his lower body into two unyielding pillars. Attempting to draw a knee up, or even just to rotate an ankle, would be a laborious, almost painful exercise in futility, accompanied by the dull, grating scrape of steel against steel. The act of sitting up, a movement so effortless for the unarmored human, transformed into a multi-stage engineering feat. The knight would likely have to use his rigid, steel-encased arms to push himself up, leveraging the ground beneath him. This would be met with a fresh wave of metallic protests, the cuirass groaning against the backplate, the pauldron scraping against the gorget, a cacophony of creaks and clanks that loudly announced his futile efforts. His abdominal muscles, weakened by the constant pressure of the breastplate, would strain, and the sheer inertia of his armored weight would fight him every inch of the way. He would rise slowly, perhaps with a grunt of exertion, transforming himself from a horizontal metallic lump into a vertical, equally metallic, but now upright, sentinel misery. His posture would be stiff, his spine protesting, and his neck, if he had kept the helm on, would be a solid column of aching discomfort. Once upright, the true physical inventory of the knight's torments would become glaringly apparent. Every point where a plate of armor pressed against his body, where a buckle dug in or a strap chafed, would now be a source of acute, localized pain. His shoulders, where the pauldrons had rested, would feel bruised and deeply uncomfortable, perhaps even showing red indentations on his skin once the armor was eventually removed. His hips, having borne the brunt of his weight, would ache with a dull, throbbing pain, radiating from where the cuisses had concentrated the pressure. The small of his back and his shoulder blades would feel as though they had spent the night pressed against a particularly aggressive rock garden, each bony prominence protesting the unyielding flatness of the backplate. Even his shins, held rigid by the greaves, might have a faint pins and needles sensation, a lingering reminder of impeded circulation. It was a waking landscape of aches and pains, a comprehensive physical complaint that covered him from head to toe. And the internal microclimate we discussed? Oh, it was still very much present. The gambeson, that thick-quilted under armor, would be thoroughly saturated with the accumulated sweat of the night. It would cling to his skin, cool and clammy, now that his body heat was no longer actively generating an internal sauna, but still deeply unpleasant. The cold, damp fabric, in combination with the equally cold steel, would send shivers through his already exhausted body. He would feel perpetually sticky, as if he had rolled in wet clay and then left to dry. The smell, too, would be particularly potent in the morning. A concentrated blend of stale sweat, metallic tang, and the indefinable scent of human weariness. His skin, having been denied any proper ventilation or movement, would feel greasy, irritated, and desperately in need of fresh air and cleansing. The unscratchable itch, that most exquisite of tortures, would inevitably persist into the morning, possibly even amplified by the new awareness of his various discomforts. That maddened prickle on his back, that tickle beneath the chin strap, that irritating sensation on his calf now, in the sober light of day, they would be even more insistent, more demanding. And still, for a knight who had, out of necessity, chosen to remain armored, the tools for relief were utterly denied. His hands, still encased in those rigid gauntlets, would be useless for the precise, delicate work of scratching. He might rub his armored arm against his armored leg, a clanking, futile gesture that would only serve to highlight his continued helplessness. The desperation to reach that one unreachable spot would be a silent, maddening scream within his mind, ensuring that even as the world awoke around him, a petty epidermal tyranny continued to reign supreme. The sounds, too, would linger. While the clanking symphony of his own shifts might have temporarily ceased with his upright posture, the lingering echoes of his helmet's internal acoustics would plague him. His own breathing, still slightly amplified in the still encased head, would feel too loud. The distant sounds of camp, the muffled chatter of squires, the distant neigh of a horse, would feel strangely muted, filtered through the steel, a disorienting contrast to the overwhelming presence of his own internal sounds from the night. His ears, having been trapped in a reverberating chamber for hours, would feel dull, almost sore, as they slowly readjusted to the unamplified reality of the outside world. He would, quite naturally, be irritable. Sleep deprivation, chronic discomfort, and the sheer, unyielding absurdity of his situation would combine to produce a demeanor best described as a perpetual low-grade grumpiness. Any minor inconvenience, any fumbling by a squire, any overly cheerful greeting, would be met with a short temper, a clipped response, or a heavy metallic sigh. The knight, whose very role demanded stoicism and martial prowess, would find himself reduced to a rather large, very expensive, and profoundly peevish tin man, dreaming only of a hot bath, a soft bed, and the glorious unencumbered sensation of scratching his own nose. The arrival of the squire, that ever-patient, ever-laborious assistant, would be both a salvation and a continuation of the morning's indignities. The knight, stiff and aching, would crave the moment of disrobing, the liberation from his metallic shell. But this, as we know, was not a swift or dignified process. It was a laborious, methodical unbuckling, unscrewing and unstrapping, often requiring the knight to lift or shift his own heavy limbs while the squire worked. The squire, with sardonic sympathy, would witness firsthand the full extent of his master's nocturnal misery. The sweat-soaked gambeson, the red marks on the skin, the deep circles under the eyes, the pervasive stiffness. Each piece removed would bring a small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief from the knight, followed almost immediately by a new ache as the previously supported weight shifted, and his body began to readjust to the absence of the steel. So the morning after, far from being a triumphant awakening, was simply a new phase of the knight's ongoing battle. He had survived the night. Yes, perhaps he was even ready for the day's skirmishes, but he was far from rested. He was stiff, sore, clammy, bruised, and utterly exhausted, his body a testament to the ironies of protection. The armor, designed to shield him from external blows, had proved to be a formidable internal tormentor, inflicting a unique brand of suffering that left him more battered than many a battle. He was a warrior, prepared to face external foes, but his greatest enemy through the long, dark hours of the night had been the very steel he wore, ensuring that even the most basic human need, the simple act of sleep, became a prolonged metallic nightmare. And as he eventually stood free of his gleaming, rigid shell, stretching with a profound, almost spiritual relief, he would undoubtedly carry the dull aches, the clammy skin, and the memory of the unscratchable itch into the waking hours. A constant, wry reminder, sleeping in a suit of armor was, without doubt, a terrible, horrible. Chapter 12. A night's bedtime routine. We have, by this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, delved deep into the manifold agonies that plagued a medieval knight audacious enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly hostile, confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized possession. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. And, through the sympathetic, sardonic eyes of his squire, we witnessed the sheer, laborious reality of donning and doffing this metallic straitjacket. Given this rather comprehensive catalogue of misery, one might assume that the knight, faced with such a nocturnal ordeal, would simply grit his teeth and endure. Yet, humanity, in its infinite capacity for adaptation, even to the most absurd of circumstances, often devises small, Desperate rituals, peculiar routines designed not to eliminate suffering, but merely to render it fractionally, agonizingly, less unbearable. And so, dear listener, we explore the night's rather absurd bedtime routine, a pathetic ballet of minor adjustments and futile hopes. First among these desperate rituals was the strategic loosening. A knight, hardened by experience, knew precisely which straps, if slightly uncinched, offered the merest whisper of relief without completely compromising his defensive integrity. The gauntlets, for instance, those stiff, articulated prisons for the hands, might be unbuckled at the wrist, allowing the fingers to curl inward just enough to alleviate the perpetual ache of being held rigidly straight. The elbow and knee counters, which locked the limbs into slightly bent positions, could sometimes be loosened, granting a millimeter or two of extra flexion. The gorget, that neck-enclosing piece, might be unfastened or slightly rotated, offering a precious opening for the throat, allowing for a marginally less stifled breath. This was a delicate dance, a perilous balancing act between comfort and preparedness. Loosen too much, and a swift attack might see a critical piece of armor shift, leaving a vulnerable gap. Loosen too little, and the knight remained an unmitigated torment. So the knight would engage in this precise, almost surgical, undressing, a small act of rebellion against the armor's tyranny, hoping for a fleeting respite that rarely materialized beyond the first few minutes. Then came the improvised padding, a testament to the desperate ingenuity born of extreme discomfort. The gambeson, while thick, was rarely sufficient cushioning against the unyielding landscape of the armor's interior or the hard ground beneath. A knight might try to fashion crude padding from whatever was at hand, a rolled-up cloak, a spare piece of linen, even a small flattened bag of straw or dried leaves collected during the day. This would be strategically placed under the most egregious pressure points, the small of the back where the cuirass dug in, the bony prominences of the hips, the elbows. The result was rarely effective. The makeshift padding would invariably shift, bunch, or compress within minutes, leaving the original pressure points or creating new, equally annoying ones. The soft clump would flatten to nothing, or migrate to a useless location, sliding out from under a shoulder with a gentle rustle, only to reappear as a new lumpy intrusion under his ribs. It was a Sisyphean task, a futile attempt to soften the unsoftenable, made all the more frustrating by the fleeting moments of imagined relief. The quest for the less worse position was another common ritual, a nocturnal contortion act performed by a man encased in steel. Lying flat on one's back was, as previously established, a particular kind of suffering. Turning onto one side, while offering the allure of a new pressure distribution, simply concentrated the armor's weight into a new singular point of acute distress on one hip or shoulder. So, the knight might attempt a semi-reclined position, leaning back against a sturdy tree trunk, a conveniently placed rock, or even the side of a supply cart, if such luxuries were available. This offered a slight angle, perhaps distributing the weight a little differently, but it also meant his spine was held rigidly, unable to curve naturally. He might try to prop his feet up on a fallen log, hoping to alleviate the pressure on his knees and ankles, only to find his legs sliding off or his sabatons clanking against the wood. Every 10 minutes, it seemed, a new position, equally unviable, would be attempted, resulting in a fresh symphony of metallic complaints and a renewed awareness of his inescapable predicament. A particularly desperate measure involved the partial removal of certain pieces, a calculated risk taken only when the perceived threat was minimal, yet not entirely absent. The helmet, as mentioned, was often the first to go, offering precious ventilation and a wider field of vision, even if the world remained a blur in the pre-dawn gloom. But sometimes even more was shed. The vambraces, those steel arm guards, might be unstrapped and laid beside him, leaving his arms protected only by mail or gambeson, a minor but significant liberation of the elbows. The sabatons, the steel foot coverings, might be removed, allowing the feet a brief, glorious stretch. This was a dangerous gamble, a trade-off between the promise of a few extra moments of less bad sleep and the potential for a swift, fatal blow to an unprotected limb. The irony being that even with these pieces off, the knight was still largely encased, still rigid, still sweaty, and still fundamentally unable to find anything resembling restful slumber. Then there was the peculiar form of passive grooming. The unscratchable itch, that maddening torment, often led to desperate, indirect measures. The knight might repeatedly tense and relax his muscles under the gambeson, hoping the slight friction would dislodge the offending irritation. He might rub his armored arm against his armored leg, producing a dull clang but no relief. Or if a squire was on watch, the knight might, with a grumbling, muffled request through his loosened gorget, implore the weary lad to reach beneath the armor and scratch that one elusive spot. The squire, armed with a padded hand, would dutifully attempt the task, knowing that true relief was impossible without a full disrobing, but performing the ritual nonetheless, a shared pantomime of futile comfort. Finally, there was the mental fortitude ritual, perhaps the most poignant and least effective of all. Faced with unending physical discomfort, the knight would attempt to retreat into his own mind. He might recite prayers, counting each bead of a rosary clutched in a rigid gauntlet, hoping to find solace in spiritual repetition. He might attempt to count sheep, a ludicrous image for a man in steel, or to mentally catalogue the battles he had fought, the foes he had vanquished, the castles he had seen. He would focus on the rhythmic sound of his own breathing, attempting to use the very amplified echoes of his helmet as a perverse, metallic meditation. But always, inevitably, the mind would drift back to the physical reality. The relentless pressure points, the clammy sweat, the maddening itch, the insidious whisper of rust, the jarring clang of his own movements. The external reality, amplified by his internal confinement, proved too powerful to overcome. These were the rituals, then. Small, pathetic acts of defiance against the overwhelming reality of steel and discomfort. They were not solutions, merely minor alterations to a perpetually unbearable state. Each loosened strap, each clumsily placed pad, each shifted position was a testament to the human desire for even the slightest mitigation of suffering, even when suffering was the very essence of the situation. The knight, engaging in these absurd bedtime routines, was a prisoner performing minor acts of rebellion against his own cell, knowing full well that true freedom, true rest, would only come with the full, laborious, and much anticipated disrobing at dawn. His was a sleep constantly interrupted, not by nightmares, but by the waking nightmare of his physical reality, a constant battle against the very gear meant to save his life. And as the night wore on, these rituals would lose their meager effectiveness, devolving back into frustrated grunts and the dull, persistent ache of profound, unalleviated discomfort. The bed of a knight in armor was truly a monument to the absurd extremes one might go to for a phantom of rest, a testament to the fact that even with the most elaborate of routines, some nights and some forms of attire are simply not conducive to anything resembling peaceful slumber. Chapter 13. The myth of the noble Snooze. We have, by this point, meticulously catalogued the myriad and frankly ludicrous agonies that would befall a medieval knight foolhardy enough, or grimly necessitated, to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly hostile confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized. We endured the relentless, cacophonous clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny, capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. Finally, we acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate: the raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness. Now, dear listener, having laid bare the comprehensive reality of this metallic nightmare, it is time to address a particularly stubborn and rather romanticized notion that, despite all logic and historical evidence, continues to cling to our collective imagination: the myth of the noble Snooze. This delightful fabrication often features prominently in historical dramas, in children's tales of valiant heroes, and in the popular consciousness, depicting a knight, perhaps after a long day of questing or defending the realm, simply slumping down, fully armored, helmet and all, into a surprisingly comfortable doze. Only to a surprisingly comfortable doze. The image is one of profound stoicism, of a warrior so dedicated, so hardy, that even the unyielding embrace of steel cannot deter his restful slumber. It is, to put it mildly, utter nonsense. Let us dismantle this charming fiction, piece by metallic piece, with the cold, hard chisel of historical truth and a dash of sardonic realism. The notion that a knight routinely slept soundly in his full battle array is akin to suggesting that modern special forces operatives, after a grueling day, regularly curl up for a peaceful 8 hours in their full tactical gear, including night vision goggles and body armor, simply because it's convenient. No, they do not, because it is profoundly, unremittingly, and utterly uncomfortable. The cinematic trope, while visually striking, is a betrayal of basic human physiology and the laws of physics. Firstly, the weight. A full suit of European plate armor, particularly from the 15th century onwards, was indeed a marvel of engineering, distributing its 50 to 70 pounds remarkably well for movement. But this distribution was for a man, standing or riding. The moment that mass was reclined horizontally, the carefully balanced weight became concentrated pressure points. Imagine trying to sleep with a 20-pound stone pressing on your chest, or a similar weight strapped to each limb. The cuirass alone, pressing down on the diaphragm, would make deep, restorative breathing a conscious effort, not the gentle, automatic rhythm of true sleep. Every slight shift of the body, which occurs subconsciously dozens of times during a normal night, would be a monumental, clanking effort, akin to trying to reorient a small, very heavy refrigerator. The idea of a knight peacefully sinking into a deep sleep under such oppressive, localized pressure is a charming fantasy. But nothing more. His body would be screaming in protest, his muscles cramping, and his circulation struggling against the metallic confines. The sleep, if it came, would be a shallow, tortured affair, punctuated by gasps and frustrated grunts. Secondly, the immobility. The armor, by its very design, limited natural movement to an extreme degree. The articulated joints allowed for range of motion necessary for combat, but they were not designed for the relaxed, fluid movements of sleep. The arms would be perpetually held in a slightly bent, often unnatural position by the vambraces and couters. The legs, encased in greaves and cuisses, would be rendered nearly inflexible, making it impossible to curl up, to stretch out, or to find any position beyond a rigid, outstretched posture. To suggest a knight could simply drift off in such a metallic straitjacket is to ignore the fundamental human need for comfortable positioning during sleep. Your own body, even without armor, will instinctively shift and adjust to alleviate pressure and find comfort. For a knight, every such instinctive twitch would be met with the unforgiving embrace of cold, hard steel, pulling him back from the precipice of slumber. The simple act of pulling a blanket up to one's chin or rolling over to escape a draft would be a physical impossibility, a cruel joke played out by the very gear meant to empower him. Then there is the sensory overload, or rather, the peculiar sensory deprivation paradox. The helmet, if worn, transformed the world into a muffled, darkened tunnel, yet simultaneously amplified every internal sound. The night's own breath became a roaring gale, his heartbeat a booming drum, his stomach a churning beast. Every cough, every sigh, every involuntary snort of sleep would reverberate through the metallic chamber, jarring him awake. The notion of a tranquil internal auditory landscape conducive to sleep simply dissolves under this reality. Outside the helmet, the world might offer silence, but inside it was a cacophony of self-generated noise. This was not the quiet solitude of slumber. It was a private metallic concert of physiological functions played at an ear-splitting volume. And the internal climate. Beneath that gleaming shell, a night wore layers of thick, padded clothing. This gambeson, essential for protection, was also an incredibly efficient insulator. The night would quickly overheat, his body attempting to cool itself through profuse sweating. This sweat, having nowhere to evaporate, would cling, creating a humid, clammy microclimate that was both oppressive and irritating. Imagine trying to sleep in a non-breathable, soaking wet sleeping bag, while simultaneously being pressed by heavy weights. The smell, the stickiness, the chafing, these are not the ingredients for a noble snooze. They are the recipe for an extended, agitated simmer in one's own bodily fluids. A profound indignity that few cinematographers dare to depict. And of course, the unscratchable itch. This mundane, yet utterly maddening torment is perhaps the greatest destroyer of the noble snooze myth. The moment any itch arises on the skin beneath the layers of padding and steel, it immediately transforms from a minor irritation into an all-consuming obsession. The hands encased in gauntlets are useless. The body, locked in its metallic embrace, cannot twist or contort to reach the offending spot. The knight, in his supposed slumber, would be mentally consumed by this singular, escalating torment. His internal monologue, a desperate, silent scream for relief that would never come. How can one sleep soundly when one's own skin is in open, unassailable rebellion? The thought alone is enough to induce a phantom itch. The grit of historical reality, as opposed to the polished sheen of romanticized fiction, reveals a truth far less glamorous and considerably more uncomfortable. Knights did not sleep soundly in their armor. They might have endured shallow, fragmented, and profoundly uncomfortable periods of rest, particularly in situations of extreme peril, when the risk of disarming outweighed the certainty of misery. But this was not sleep as we understand it. It was a state of heightened semi-consciousness, a reluctant surrender to exhaustion, punctuated by physical pain, psychological distress, and the constant nagging awareness of their metallic confinement. The myth of the noble snooze serves to elevate the night to a superhuman status, detached from the petty physical realities that plague mere mortals. It suggests a fortitude that transcends pain and discomfort, implying that their dedication to duty was so absolute that even their biological needs could be bent to its will. The truth is far more human, and arguably far more admirable in its own way. A knight who spent a night in his armor was not sleeping soundly. He was enduring, gritting his teeth, fighting a battle against his own body, his own mind, and the very protection he wore. He was making a grim, pragmatic choice, trading profound discomfort for a fractional increase in readiness, a testament not to a magical ability to sleep through anything, but to the sheer terrifying necessity of his profession. So, the next time you encounter the cinematic image of a knight peacefully slumbering in his full regalia, remember the hidden reality. Remember the heavy weight the clammy sweat, the maddening itch, the clanking symphony, the echoing helmet, and the gnawing fear. That serene visage on screen conceals a night of torment, a profound lack of actual sleep, and a morning after filled with stiffness, aches, and a desperate desire for the mundane luxury of a scratch. The noble snooze, dear listener, was a beautiful lie, replaced by a gritty, clanking, and profoundly unsnoozable historical truth. Chapter 14. The armor's whisper we have, by this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, delve deep into the manifold agonies that plagued a medieval knight, audacious enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly hostile, cons of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the unattainable fantasy. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. Finally, we acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate. The raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness. Now, dear listener, having explored the physical and psychological landscapes of this metallic hell, let us turn our attention to the auditory realm, for within the armor silence was a myth, and the creaks and groans of metal became a knight's only, profoundly ironic lullaby. Imagine, if you will, the knight lying stiffly on his back, eyes perhaps staring into the metallic gloom of his helmet, or up at the rough canvas of a tent. The sounds of the outside world, if they penetrated at all, would be muffled, distant, and indistinct. The gentle rustle of leaves, the soft hoot of an owl, the distant murmur of a sentry, these were alien sounds, filtered through layers of steel and padding. What filled his ears, what truly resonated in the confines of his steel shell, was a private mechanical symphony, a continuous dialogue between metal and gravity, friction and fatigue. This was the armor's whisper, a peculiar, grating and utterly inescapable lullaby that spoke only of discomfort and confinement. It would begin with a subtle shift of weight, the barely perceptible sigh of his own body attempting to settle. The cuirass, that formidable breastplate, would groan against the backplate with a deep, resonant rumble, a sound like an old ship's timbers protesting against a heavy sea. This was not a quick, singular noise. It was a drawn-out, protesting egerang that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. As his shoulders settled into the ground, the pauldrons, those magnificent pieces of articulated steel, would emit a series of sharp, protesting inscrapes, each tiny movement of the lames against each other producing a friction that grated on the nerves. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny, unseen teeth grinding against each other, an incessant declaration of the armor's unyielding presence. Every joint, every articulation, seemed to have its own unique voice in this metallic chorus. The counters protecting his elbows would squeak faintly as he attempted to relax his forearms, a high-pitched, insistent eek squeal that pierced the thicker sounds. The polins, at his knees, would emit a dull, almost wet clunking as they settled, the sound amplified and reverberating through the steel of the greaves and cuisses. His gauntlets, those rigid steel gloves, would respond to any involuntary twitch of his fingers with a series of precise, dry clicks, like a macabre abacus counting off the moments of his wakefulness. Each sound, though perhaps small in isolation, contributed to a relentless, ever-present auditory landscape, preventing any true silence. This was the melody of his captivity, a soundtrack composed of his own efforts to find a moment's peace. The leather straps, essential for holding the disparate pieces of armor together, also added their own unique texture to this symphony. As they stretched, shifted, or tightened with the subtle movements of his breathing or the changes in his body's conformation, they would emit a dry, protesting iron creaking, a sound both mundane and profoundly irritating. The fabric of the gambeson, rubbing against the mail and the inner surface of the plate, would produce a faint rustling hiss, a constant, low-level background noise that prevented the mind from truly drifting. It was the sound of his own layers, his own protection, conspiring against his rest, a ceaseless, sibilant whisper of restriction. This was his lullaby not because it was soothing, but because it was the only consistent sound available to him, the constant auditory backdrop to his attempted slumber. There was no escaping it. It was intrinsically linked to his very attempt at rest, a perverse soundtrack to his physical and psychological torment. The irony was profound. The sounds of his protective shell, meant to shield him from the chaos of battle, became the very chaos of his night. The rhythmic nature of these sounds, far from lulling him into a serene sleep, would instead trap his mind in a state of hyper-awareness. He would anticipate the next groan of the cuirass, the next squeak of the elbow joint, the next scrape of the pauldron. His brain, starved of true rest, would cling to these sounds, dissecting them, analyzing them, ensuring that no moment of genuine unconsciousness could take hold. The helmet, if still worn, acted as a cruel amplifier for this internal orchestra. Each creak and groan, each scrape and clank would reverberate within the enclosed space, seemingly louder, sharper, more insistent. The limited ventilation meant that the sounds were contained, bouncing off the interior surfaces, creating a full-body auditory immersion. His own movements, however minute, would be met with an almost disproportionate auditory response, ensuring that he was perpetually reminded of the hundreds of pounds of steel strapped to his form. It was a sensory experience designed to prevent rest, a relentless mechanical echo of his physical predicament. This metallic serenade contributed to the night's profound sleep deprivation in several insidious ways. Firstly, it prevented him from reaching the deeper stages of sleep, perpetually jolting him back to a state of light awareness. Secondly, the constant noise, even when not jarring, maintained a state of mental tension, preventing the mind from truly unwinding and finding peace. He was always on, always listening, even if only to the internal workings of his own armored prison. This auditory assault was a form of psychological torture, slowly eroding his mental fortitude, making him more irritable, more prone to mistakes, and more deeply exhausted with each passing hour. The romanticized image of the knight, sleeping peacefully in his armor, dissolves completely under the weight of this auditory reality. There was no serene slumber, no quiet contemplation. There was only the perpetual symphony of metal, a language of groans, scrapes, and clanks, speaking volumes of discomfort, restriction, and unyielding weight. This was the armor's whisper, a constant grating presence that reminded the knight of his every ache, every impossible itch, every stifled breath. It was a lullaby composed not of gentle melodies, but of the very sounds of his own metallic prison, ensuring that even in the darkest hours of night, true peace remained an unattainable, mocking dream. His sleep, if it came at all, was a testament to sheer, desperate exhaustion, a shallow dip into unconsciousness, from which he would be pulled back, again and again, by the relentless, unyielding, and profoundly unsleepable whisper of his steel. Chapter 15. The peasant's advantage we have. By this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, painstakingly dissected the manifold agonies that would befall a medieval knight so unwise, or so grimly necessitated, as to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly hostile, confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized possession. We endured the relentless, cacophonous clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. We even acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate, the raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness, making his armor a grim, necessary nightmare. Now, dear listener, having fully immersed ourselves in the intricate metallic hell of the noble warrior's nocturnal existence, let us cast our gaze lower, much lower, down to the very base of the medieval social hierarchy. Let us consider the humble peasant, the serf tied to the land, the forgotten mass upon whose endless toil the entire feudal system rested. His life was undeniably harsh, brutish, and often short. He faced starvation, disease, the arbitrary cruelty of his lord, and the constant threat of roving bandits or passing armies. His days were spent in back-breaking labor, his hands calloused from the plow, his body aching from dawn till dusk. His bed, if he was fortunate enough to have one, was likely a thin sack of straw on a dirt floor, shared perhaps with family or even livestock. His clothing was coarse, homespun wool or linen, often patched and threadbare, worn until it literally disintegrated. And yet, for all his earthly disadvantages, for all his grinding poverty and lack of status, the peasant possessed one profound, undeniable, and deeply ironic advantage over the knight: the glorious, unencumbered freedom to actually sleep. Imagine, if you will, our peasant, after a long, grueling day tilling the Lord's fields or tending to his meager patch of crops. His muscles ache, his stomach rumbles, and his limbs are heavy with exhaustion. He retreats to his hovel, a smoky, dimly lit space, perhaps sharing it with a pig or a few chickens. He peels off his rough woolen tunic and breeches, garments that, while from luxurious, were at least flexible and relatively lightweight. He might keep on a simple linen undershirt or sleep in naught but his undergarments. He lies down on his straw pallet, and here the profound difference emerges. There is no crushing weight pressing him into the earth. His body is free to conform to the irregularities of the straw, to shift, to turn, to curl into a fettled position if he so chooses. His spine, though perhaps accustomed to a daily stoop, is not rigidly held by an unyielding backplate. His shoulders are not being dug into by the cruel curve of a pauldron. His hips are not throbbing from the concentrated pressure of a cuisse. He can stretch out, fully extend his legs, draw his knees up to his chest, or roll onto his side without a groan of protest from metal or a series of jarring clanks. His limbs, though tired, are supple, unconstrained by vambraces or greaves. His hands, though calloused, are free to curl, to relax, to perform the simple, unconscious movements that facilitate natural rest. He is not a heavy metallic automaton. He is a human body seeking repose, and the glorious absence of the metallic symphony. When the peasant shifts, there is only the soft rustle of straw, the faint whisper of coarse fabric against itself, perhaps the gentle sigh of his own breath. There is no grinding groan of a cuirass, no sharp scrape of a pauldron, no insistent squeak of a joint. His ears are not assailed by the loud, echoing thrum of his own heartbeat, or the booming roar of his own breath reverberating within a steel helm. The world outside, though perhaps still filled with the distant sounds of wind or animals, is not filtered through a metallic tunnel, nor drowned out by the internal cacophony of his own bodily functions. He might hear the soft snores of his family, the rustle of a mouse in the thatch, or the distant barking of a dog, but these are organic sounds, natural to his humble existence, not the relentless mechanical torment of the night's metallic prison. The very quietude, a luxury denied to the knight in his armor, is the peasant's unwitting birthright. Then there's the internal climate. The peasant, clothed in humble rags, is not encased in an insulating system designed for battlefield protection. His simple garments allow for airflow, for the dissipation of heat. His sweat, though certainly present after a hard day's work, is free to evaporate, to cool his skin. He does not lie in a humid, stifling microclimate, stewing in his own accumulating moisture. There is no pervasive, clammy stickiness, no constant, oppressive warmth that cycles into chills as the metal cools. His skin, though perhaps rough and dirty, is not trapped against sweat-soaked padding and unforgiving steel, preventing chafing and irritation. He experiences the simple, direct comfort of air on skin, a primal luxury the knight could only dream of. And oh, the unscratchable itch. This, perhaps more than any other torment, highlights the peasant's singular advantage. When an itch arises on the peasant's skin, whether from a flea, a patch of irritation, or simply the daily grime, his hand is free. Unhindered by rigid gauntlets, unconstrained by layers of steel and thick padding, his fingers can reach. He can scratch it with vigorous abandon, providing that immediate, satisfying relief that is a fundamental human need. The maddening prickle is met with a swift counterattack, and quickly subdued. He does not lie there, consumed by a petty tyranny, driven to the brink of raving lunacy by a microscopic torment he cannot possibly alleviate. The peasant, for all his struggles, retains mastery over his own skin, a simple dignity denied to the armored lord. The irony is profound, almost comedic in its bleakness. The knight, the very symbol of power, wealth, and martial prowess, slept a tortured, fragmented sleep, burdened by the instruments of his own noble station. His protection, his status, his very identity as a warrior became the source of his profound, nocturnal misery. He traded the fleeting peace of slumber for the grim, vigilant readiness that might, just might, save his life from an external threat. Meanwhile, the peasant, possessing nothing but the clothes on his back and the dirt beneath his feet, endured a life of hardship. Yet when it came to the simple act of resting his weary body, he enjoyed a physical freedom that his lord could only yearn for. The peasant's rags, though humble and often infested, allowed his body to relax, to breathe, to find a measure of natural comfort that the most expensive, meticulously crafted suit of armor could never provide. Peasant's dreams, though perhaps haunted by the specter of hunger or the Lord's tax collector, were likely unburdened by the specific metallic frustrations of the night. He might dream of a bountiful harvest, or a full belly, or a simple day free from toil. He would not dream of being trapped, unable to move, his limbs slowly hardening into steel. He would not awaken with the jarring clank of his own movements, or the amplified echoes of his own breath. His mornings, though still demanding, were not preceded by the arduous, painful process of extracting himself from a damp, stiff, steel prison. He simply stretched, perhaps groaned from aching muscles, and then rose, his body free, ready to face the day's labor, unburdened by the physical and psychological hangover of an armored knight. This juxtaposition serves as a stark, darkly humorous commentary on the true cost of status and the peculiar ironies of human existence. The knight, ostensibly at the pinnacle of medieval society, possessed every advantage save one: the basic, unheralded blessing of unencumbered sleep. The peasant, at the very bottom, owned little, but he owned the quiet, unimpeded right to simply lie down, to stretch, to scratch an itch, and to sink into a sleep that, though often disturbed by external realities, was at least not actively sabotaged by the very clothes on his back. His rags, while a symbol of his poverty, were also a testament to his simple, unassuming freedom. The armor, while a symbol of the knight's power, was also his nightly prison. And in the silent, dark hours between dusk and dawn, the peasant, unburdened by the weight of ambition or the clang of his own prestige, truly held the advantage. Chapter 16. The chronic insomniac night we have, by this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, painstakingly dissected the manifold agonies that would befall a medieval knight so unwise, or so grimly necessitated, as to attempt slumber within the gleaming yet profoundly hostile confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized possession. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom, snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. We even acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate: the raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness, making his armor a grim, necessary nightmare. We debunked the notion of the noble snooze, replacing it with the gritty, uncomfortable truth. Now, dear listener, having established the general nocturnal torment of the armored knight, let us introduce a specific hypothetical case, a man for whom sleep was not merely difficult, but a lifelong, elusive phantom. Sir Reginald Reggie Fitzwilliam, the chronic insomniac knight, a figure whose tale blends the historical reality of armored suffering with a general. Sir Reginald was not born into sleep. He was born, rather, into a perpetual state of mild, simmering wakefulness. Even as a babe, his nursemaids recounted, he rarely truly napped. He merely rested his eyes with an intensity that belied his tender years. As a page, he was the boy who knew precisely where every candle was lit in the castle at 3 a.m., and who could identify the precise creak of the kitchen door. That meant the scullery maid was sneaking a midnight snack. As a squire, he perfected the art of polishing armor under moonlight, not out of diligence, but because he was awake anyway. When the trumpet sounded for morning training, Sir Reginald was rarely roused. He was merely released from his contemplation of the ceiling. His peers, blessed with the normal oblivion of youth, often found his perpetual alertness unsettling, while their masters appreciated his unwavering watchfulness, unaware that it stemmed not from devotion, but from a fundamental inability to switch off his own internal monologue. Then came the armor. For most knights, as we have painstakingly detailed, the act of attempting to sleep in a full suit of plate was an emergency measure, a night of singular, memorable torment. For Sir Reginald, it was simply the amplification of his existing, profound, and utterly incurable condition. His life was not divided into waking and sleeping. It was divided into actively performing nightly duties and attempting miserably to not perform nightly duties while still very much aware of everything. The armor, therefore, was not merely a physical burden. It was a cosmic joke, a cruel, metallic exacerbator of his already precarious relationship with repose. Consider the weight, dynamite. For Reggie, that 50 to 70 pounds was not merely an oppressive force. It was a physical manifestation of the sleepless hours piling up on his chest. Every ounce of steel seemed to whisper, "You are tired, but you are also quite heavy, are you not? Feel that pressure? That's exhaustion, literally." He found himself counting not sheep, but rivets, each one a tiny metallic reminder of the unyielding barrier between him and oblivion. He would try to shift, to alleviate the pressure on his hip, and the resulting groan of the cuirass was not just a sound, but a personal sigh of metallic exasperation from the armor itself, as if it too was weary of his futile attempts at comfort. "Oh, is Sir Reginald trying to find a soft spot again? It seemed to Clank how quaint. We are steel, Sir Reginald. There are no soft spots. The sweat and humidity, a misery for any night, became a particular form of hell for Reginald. His body, already running on a low hum of perpetual anxiety, would generate an astonishing amount of heat. The gambeson, which for others was merely an insulator, became a personal medieval swamp suit for him. He imagined himself slowly poaching, a nightly stew simmering in his own juices. The clammy stickiness, the inability to cool, only intensified his restless energy. He would lie there, eyes wide open in the metallic darkness, feeling each bead of sweat trickle down his back, 1,000 tiny maddening rivulets that he could do absolutely nothing about. The unscratchable itch, already a universal torment, was for Reggie a relentless personal vendetta waged by his own skin. He had, on occasion, attempted to plead with his squire, young Thomas, a lad who already looked perpetually exhausted from Reginald's nocturnal demands. "Thomas, my boy," Reggie would rasp from within his helm, his voice muffled and distorted. "There is a demon, a tiny, maddening demon, residing just beneath my left pauldron. It dances the jig of damnation upon my skin. For the love of all that is holy, scratch it." Thomas, with a sigh barely audible over the metallic chorus of Reggie's attempts to writhe, would dutifully attempt to reach, knowing full well that true relief was a dream as distant as Reggie's own sleep. The clanking lullaby, that symphony of metallic discord, was Reginald's constant companion. He knew every creak, every groan, every minute vibration of his armor with an almost scholarly precision. He could tell the difference between the settling sigh of his breastplate and the protesting squeak of his elbow joint. He had, on particularly desperate nights, tried to compose ballads in his head, using the rhythms of his own armor as a percussive backdrop, but they always ended up sounding like a blacksmith's shop during an earthquake. The helmet, if he dared to keep it on, amplified his own internal sounds to a grotesque degree. His heartbeat, a frantic drum solo. His breathing, the roar of a dragon in a cavern. His stomach, a gurgling, squelching swamp beast. He was a captive audience to his own biological symphony, a one-man orchestra of sleeplessness. His dreams, when they came, were less of heroic battles and more of absurd, frustrating endeavors. He'd find himself in an endless corridor, trying to run, but his limbs would be encased in leaden, invisible versions of his armor, each step a monumental effort. He tried to pluck a single, perfectly ripe plum from a tree, only to find his hands locked into rigid gauntlets, unable to grasp. He'd dream of a perfect, soft feather bed, reaching for it with desperate yearning, only for it to transform into a shimmering, hard sheet of polished steel just as he touched it. He'd wake with a groan, not of fear, but of profound, existential weariness, confirmed by the familiar weight of his armor. Sir Reginald's chronic sleeplessness, exacerbated by his chosen profession's protective attire, had rather predictable consequences. He was perpetually irritable, his temper a short fuse lit by the slightest inconvenience. His strategic decisions were often unconventional, perhaps born of a mind that had spent too many hours contemplating the absurdities of the universe rather than resting. His battle cries were less inspiring roars and more exhausted grunts. He became known for his profound grumpiness, his dark circles, and his uncanny ability to spot enemy sentries kilometers away, not because he was a brilliant tactician, but because he was simply gawaki at the precise moment they made their move. His squires, inheriting this peculiar burden, developed their own coping mechanisms. Young Thomas, now a veteran of Reginald's sleepless nights, had perfected the art of silent, efficient armor removal, often before the night had fully registered the dawn. He learned to anticipate Reginald's grumbles, to preempt his demands for a back scratch, and to instinctively apply oil to creaking joints before they even had a chance to protest. It was a bizarre, codependent relationship, built on the foundation of one man's endless wakefulness and another's endless, weary service. So, for Sir Reginald, the knight in shining armor, the nightly ordeal was not an exception but the rule. His armor, while protecting him from external foes, was his greatest internal tormentor. It was a perpetual metallic reminder of his own biological failing, a constant clanking symbol of his inability to achieve the most basic human need. He was a man of steel, yes, but a man made entirely of weariness, a walking, clanking testament to the fact that even the most formidable warrior can be utterly defeated by the simple, elusive act of sleep, especially when encased in several dozen pounds of unyielding, unsnooze-friendly metal. His tale, dear listener, is a dry, poignant comedy of errors, a reminder that some nightmares are not of monsters and dragons, but of pressure points, sweat, and the maddening, undeniable reality that you cannot, for the life of you, get comfortable. Chapter 17. The Armor Maker's Secret. We have, by this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, painstakingly dissected the manifold agonies that would befall medieval knight so unwise, or so grimly necessitated, as to attempt slumber within the gleaming yet profoundly hostile confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized possession. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. We even acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate: the raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness, making his armor a grim, necessary night. We debunked the notion of the noble snooze, replacing it with the gritty, uncomfortable truth, and finally, we contrasted the knight's metallic misery with the humble, surprisingly luxurious freedom of the peasant's sleep. Now, dear listener, let us pull back the curtain on those magnificent artisans who conjured these steel cocoons into being. For the armorers, with their hammers and anvils, their forges, and their shrewd eyes, held a quiet, professional secret. They knew, with an almost artistic detachment, that their masterpieces of protection were quite simply torture devices when it came to a good knife. The medieval armorer was no mere blacksmith. He was an engineer, an artist, a master of metallurgy and human anatomy. His craft demanded immense skill, precision, and an almost intuitive understanding of how steel would behave under heat and hammer. Each plate was meticulously shaped, hardened and polished, designed not merely to deflect a blow, but to flow with a human form, allowing a remarkable degree of mobility for a man encased in so much metal. They took immense pride in their work, in the gleaming curves and articulated joints that allowed a knight to fight, to ride, to wield a weapon with a semblance of unhindered grace. But the very qualities that made a suit of armor effective in battle also made it profoundly, hilariously, and quite inescapably unsuitable for anything resembling comfortable slumber. And the armorers knew this. Oh, how they knew! It was an unspoken truth, a professional secret shared in quiet nods over the glowing embers of the forge or the rhythmic clang of the hammer. They would watch a knight being fitted, observing how the steel hugged the body, how the weight settled, how the joints articulated. They saw the grimaces as a buckle pinched, the subtle shifts as a plate pressed too hard during movement, and they would adjust, hammer, and polish until the fit was as perfect as humanly possible for the rigors of combat. But their minds, sharp and practical, understood the fundamental laws of physics and physiology. They understood that a body designed for standing and fighting was not designed for lying flat on a hard surface, encased in dozens of pounds of rigid, unforgiving material. They knew that the very distribution of weight that felt balanced when upright would concentrate into agonizing pressure points the moment that weight was laid horizontally. Imagine an armorer, perhaps a grizzled veteran named Master Ulrich, observing a young, eager knight during a fitting. The knight would flex, turn, practice a sword swing, marveling at the freedom of movement. Master Ulrich would nod, his eyes shrewd, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. He knew that the precisely curved breastplate that protected the vital organs would, when pressed against the ground, restrict breathing and dig into the sternum. He knew that the meticulously articulated gauntlets, designed to grasp a sword hilt, would lock fingers into an uncomfortable rigidity the moment the hand tried to relax. He knew that the greaves, so elegant in their protection of the shins, would turn a knight's legs into unbendable planks when he attempted to find repose. It was not a flaw in his design. It was an inherent quality of the material and its purpose. His armor was for waking, fighting, and surviving, not for sleeping. That was the knight's folly, or his unfortunate necessity, not the armorer's concern. They listened, too, to the occasional, mumbled complaints from their clients. Not outright declarations of nocturnal torment, for a knight was too proud for such admissions, but subtle clues. A knight might return after a long campaign, ordering extra padding for his gambeson, muttering vaguely about long hours in the saddle or sleeping rough. Master Ulrich would nod sagely, knowing full well that sleeping rough often involved attempting to catch a few miserable hours in the very armor he had crafted. He might suggest a slightly thicker lining in the helmet, knowing it might dull the internal echoes for a fraction, but also knowing it wouldn't solve the issue of a muffled, stale breath. He might offer a special oil for the joints, not just for protection against rust, but knowing that a well-lubricated joint, though still a clanking nuisance when shifted in the dead of night, would at least creak with less immediate agony. These were small, almost homeopathic remedies, offered with a straight face and a quiet understanding that the problem was fundamental, not curable. The armorers, having spent their lives working with steel, understood its properties implicitly. They knew how it conducted heat, how it would become a personal oven on a warm night, or leach warmth from the body on a cold one, leading to that peculiar cycle of sweat and shivers. They knew how unforgiving its surface was, how it would press, chafe, and rub against the most delicate skin through any amount of padding. They probably had their own internal jokes, quiet jests about a night's sudden, profound need for a scratch between the shoulder blades, or the unseemly clatter emanating from a tent on a moonless night. They would have heard the grumbling, sleep-deprived knights who came back to their workshops, not for repairs from battle, but for subtle adjustments to alleviate phantom pains, for advice on how to make the unmakeable comfortable. The secret was not that armor was poorly made. Quite the opposite. It was too well made for comfort. Its very effectiveness in providing rigid protection against blows made it a nightmare for relaxation. The armorers were masters of their trade, capable of transforming cold steel into a second skin of defense. But a skin, they knew, that offered no respite, no natural movement, no true softness. They built cages of protection, and they knew those cages were profoundly uncomfortable for anyone attempting to hibernate within them. Their sly wit lay in the quiet satisfaction that their creations, while perhaps causing immense nocturnal misery, were doing exactly what they were designed to do: prevent penetration, not facilitate peaceful dreams. Their job was to keep the night alive, not well rested. And in that, they succeeded admirably, even if it meant their clientele suffered from chronic sleep deprivation. Perhaps in the deep quiet of their workshops, after the last apprentice had departed and the forge fire had died down, an armorer might sit, contemplating a newly polished breastplate. He might run a gloved hand over its smooth, cold surface, admiring its perfect curve, its resilient strength. And he might, with a faint, knowing smirk, imagine the noble, perhaps slightly arrogant, knight who would soon wear it. He would picture him, not on a grand steed, but lying stiffly on the ground, struggling to breathe, unable to scratch a particularly persistent itch, listening to the incessant creak and groan of the very masterpiece now protecting him. A master craftsman, seeing his work, knowing its purpose, and understanding its inevitable, hilarious, and profoundly uncomfortable side effects. That was the armor-maker's secret, a silent testament to the ironic truth that the pinnacle of medieval protection was also, quite inadvertently, a highly effective and utterly sleepless torture chamber. They built magnificent cocoons of steel, fully aware that the butterflies inside would never truly get to sleep. Chapter 17. The armor-maker's secret we have, by this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, painstakingly dissected the manifold agonies that would befall a medieval knight so unwise, or so grimly necessitated, as to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly hostile, confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized possession. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. We even acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate: the raw primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness, making his armor a grim, necessary nightmare. We debunked the notion of the noble snooze, replacing it with the gritty, uncomfortable truth. And finally we contrasted the knight's metallic misery with the humble, surprisingly luxurious freedom of the peasant's sleep. Now, dear listener, let us pull back the curtain on those magnificent artisans who conjured these steel cocoons into being. For the armorers, with their hammers and anvils, their forges, and their shrewd eyes, held a quiet, professional secret. They knew with an almost artistic detachment that their masterpieces of protection were, quite simply, torture devices when it came to a good night's rest. The medieval armorer was no mere blacksmith. He was an engineer, an artist, a master of metallurgy and human anatomy. His craft demanded immense skill, precision, and an almost intuitive understanding of how steel would behave under heat and hammer. Each plate was meticulously shaped, hardened, and polished, designed not merely to deflect a blow, but to flow with the human form, allowing a remarkable degree of mobility for a man encased in so much metal. They took immense pride in their work, in the gleaming curves and articulated joints that allowed a knight to fight, to ride, to wield a weapon with a semblance of unhindered grace. But the very qualities that made a suit of armor effective in battle also made it profoundly, hilariously, and quite inescapably unsuitable for anything resembling comfortable slumber. And the armorers knew this. Oh, how they knew! It was an unspoken truth, a professional secret shared in quiet nods over the glowing embers of the forge or the rhythmic clang of the hammer. They would watch a knight being fitted, observing how the steel hugged the body, how the weight settled, how the joints articulated. They saw the grimaces as a buckle pinched, the subtle shifts as a plate pressed too hard during movement, and they would adjust, hammer, and polish until the fit was as perfect as humanly possible for the rigors of combat. But their minds, sharp and practical, understood the fundamental laws of physics and physiology. They understood that a body designed for standing and fighting was not designed for lying flat on a hard surface, encased in dozens of pounds of rigid, unforgiving material. They knew that the very distribution of weight that felt balanced when upright would concentrate into agonizing pressure, points the moment that weight was laid horizontally. Imagine an armorer, perhaps a grizzled veteran named Master Ulrich, observing a young eager knight during a fitting. The knight would flex, turn, practice a sword swing, marveling at the freedom of movement. Master Ulrich would nod, his eyes shrewd, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. He knew that the precisely curved breastplate that protected the vital organs would, when pressed against the ground, restrict breathing and dig into the sternum. He knew that the meticulously articulated gauntlets, designed to grasp a sword hilt, would lock fingers into an uncomfortable rigidity the moment the hand tried to relax. He knew that the greaves, so elegant in their protection of the shins, would turn a knight's legs into unbendable planks when he attempted to find repose. It was not a flaw in his design. It was an inherent quality of the material and its purpose. His armor was for waking, fighting, and surviving, not for sleeping. That was the knight's folly, or his unfortunate necessity, not the armorer's concern. They listened, too, to the occasional mumbled complaints from their clients, not outright declarations of nocturnal torment, for a knight was too proud for such admissions, but subtle clues. A knight might return after a long campaign, ordering extra padding for his gambeson, muttering vaguely about long hours in the saddle or sleeping rough. Master Ulrich would nod sagely, knowing full well that sleeping rough often involved attempting to catch a few miserable hours in the very armor he had crafted. He might suggest a slightly thicker lining in the helmet, knowing it might dull the internal echoes for a fraction, but also knowing it wouldn't solve the issue of a muffled, stale breath. He might offer a special oil for the joints, not just for protection against rust, but knowing that a well-lubricated joint, though still a clanking nuisance when shifted in the dead of night, would at least creak with less immediate agony. But these were small, almost homeopathic remedies, offered with a straight face and a quiet understanding that the problem was fundamental, not curable. The armorers, having spent their lives working with steel, understood its properties implicitly. They knew how it conducted heat, how it would become a personal oven on a warm night, or leach warmth from the body on a cold one, leading to that peculiar cycle of sweat and shivers. They knew how unforgiving its surface was, how it would press, chafe, and rub against the most delicate skin through any amount of padding. They probably had their own internal jokes, quiet jests about a night's sudden, profound need for a scratch between the shoulder blades, or the unseemly clatter emanating from a tent on a moonless night. They would have heard the grumbling, sleep-deprived knights who came back to their workshops, not for repairs from battle, but for subtle adjustments to alleviate phantom pains, for advice on how to make the unmakeable comfortable. The secret was not that armor was poorly made, quite the opposite. It was too well made for comfort. Its very effectiveness in providing rigid protection against blows made it a nightmare for relaxation. The armorers were masters of their trade, capable of transforming cold steel into a second skin of defense. But a skin, they knew, that offered no respite, no natural movement, no true softness. They built cages of protection, and they knew those cages were profoundly uncomfortable for anyone attempting to hibernate within them. Their sly wit lay in the quiet satisfaction that their creations, while perhaps causing immense nocturnal misery, were doing exactly what they were designed to do: prevent penetration, not facilitate peaceful dreams. Their job was to keep the night alive, not well rested. And in that, they succeeded admirably, even if it meant their clientele suffered from chronic sleep deprivation. Perhaps in the deep quiet of their workshops after the last apprentice had departed, and the forge fire had died down, an armorer might sit contemplating a newly polished breastplate. He might run a gloved hand over its smooth, cold surface, admiring its perfect curve, its resilient strength. And he might, with a faint, knowing smirk, imagine the noble, perhaps slightly arrogant, knight who would soon wear it. He would picture him, not on a grand steed, but lying stiffly on the ground, struggling to breathe, unable to scratch a particularly persistent itch, listening to the incessant creak and groan of the very masterpiece now protecting him. A master craftsman seeing his work, knowing its purpose, and understanding its inevitable, hilarious, and profoundly uncomfortable side effects. That was the armor-maker's secret, a silent testament to the ironic truth that the pinnacle of medieval protection was also, quite inadvertently, a highly effective and utterly sleepless torture chamber. They built magnificent cocoons of steel, fully aware that the butterflies inside would never truly get to sleep. Chapter 18. The last straw we have. By this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, painstakingly dissected the manifold agonies that would befall a medieval knight so unwise, or so grimly necessitated, as to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly hostile, confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of destroyer. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. We even acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate: the raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness, making his armor a grim, necessary nightmare. We debunked the notion of the noble Snooze, replacing it with the gritty, uncomfortable truth, and contrasted the knight's metallic misery with the humble, surprisingly luxurious freedom of the peasant's sleep. Finally, we pulled back the curtain on the armorers who, with sly wit, knew their creations were, in fact, masterfully crafted torture chambers for anyone attempting to rest within them. Now, dear listener, having laid bare the full spectrum of this metallic misery, let us consider the precise moment, the final, minuscule indignity that pushed a knight, any knight, from reluctant endurance to outright, desperate surrender, the last straw. Imagine, if you will, Sir Calen, a knight of some repute currently engaged in the slow, grinding misery of a siege. For 3 weeks his days have been a blur of mud, the thud of siege engines, and the incessant high-pitched whine of crossbow bolts. His nights have been worse. The enemy, desperate, had been known to launch sudden, suicidal sallies from the gates, and the watch on the ramparts was a perpetual state of hypervigilance. So, for 3 agonizing weeks, Sir Calen had made the grim choice. His armor, or at least the major components, remained on, loosened slightly, perhaps the helm removed and placed just beside his head, but otherwise a constant, crushing presence. His sleep had become a series of agitated micronaps, punctuated by phantom alarms, genuine calls to vigilance, and the relentless internal assault of his own body trapped in steel. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot, his temper a frayed rope, and his skin felt like a perpetually damp, itchy battlefield of its own. This particular night, however, had been worse than usual. The weather had turned, a cold, persistent drizzle having begun at dusk, seeping into the ground, turning his makeshift straw pallet into a damp, squelching mess. The metal of his armor, cooled by the damp air, now felt like an array of frigid plates pressing against his already clammy gambeson. His shoulders, where the pauldrons had rested for weeks, throbbed with a dull, pervasive ache that radiated down his arms. His hips felt like 2 tenderized cuts of meat, perpetually pressed against unyielding steel and a now soggy bed of straw. Every breath, constrained by the cuirass, was shallow and unsatisfying, filling his chest with a stale, metallic-scented air. Had tried the strategic loosening of straps, a futile ballet of adjustment that only ever provided fleeting, illusory relief before the weight redistributed itself into new, equally agonizing pressure points. Had attempted the improvised padding, stuffing a rolled-up, damp piece of spare linen under his aching lower back, only for it to migrate insidiously and become a new lump under his spine within minutes. Each of these desperate efforts had been accompanied by the clanking lullaby, that symphony of metallic complaints that sounded, in the pre-dawn gloom, like a blacksmith's apprentice trying to assemble a cart in the dark with a mallet and a handful of nails. He finally drifted into one of his shallow, fragmented dozes, a mere skim across the surface of unconsciousness. In this fragile state, his mind conjured a dream, not of glorious battle or a warm hearth, but of an endless green meadow where he was running, utterly unburdened, the wind rushing through his unhelmed hair, his limbs pumping freely, joyously. He reached out to pluck a single perfectly ripe berry from a bush, his fingers closing around its plump form. But just as his dream fingers closed, they stiffened, transformed into the rigid, unyielding form of his gauntlets. The berry, once soft, became a tiny, hard, metallic sphere digging into his steel palm. The green meadow dissolved into the gray, metallic gloom of his internal helmet, and the wind became the stale, echoing rush of his own breath. He jolted awake, not from an external sound, but from the cruel, internal betrayal of his own subconscious. His heart hammered against the unyielding breastplate, an amplified drum of frustration. And then it happened. A single, utterly maddening. An profoundly unreachable itch ignited on his right inner thigh, just at the crease where the quiz met the gambeson. It was a subtle prickle at first, a mere whisper of irritation, but in his sleep-deprived, overwrought state, magnified by the complete and utter inability to reach it, it blossomed. It became a crawl, a burn, a persistent, infuriating tickle that screamed for attention. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the distant sound of the sentry's cough, or the relentless, monotonous drip of rain on his tent. But the itch was a malevolent entity, growing in intensity, darting across his skin like 100 tiny, invisible spiders. He clenched his gauntleted hands, useless iron clubs for this delicate task. He tried to rub his thigh against his other leg, a desperate, awkward maneuver that resulted in a scraping thunking of armor plates, but no relief. He tried to contort his body, to twist, to squirm like a fish caught in a net, but the cuirass held him fast, a straitjacket of steel. Every strained movement, every grunt of frustration only sent fresh waves of metallic clatter echoing around him. The cumulative effect of 3 weeks of this precise form of torment, coupled with the immediate, inescapable agony of the itch, suddenly broke him. It wasn't the fear of death, or the pangs of hunger, or the weariness of battle that finally snapped Sir Calen. It was the absolute, soul-crushing indignity of being utterly defeated by a single microscopic epidermal irritation. A silent, utterly desperate scream rose in his throat, muffled by the layers of padding and the cold steel. "No more kistai, inso istadane." With a new, resolute, if utterly exhausted, energy, Sir Calen began to move. He was not rousing for battle. He was ridding himself of its very symbol. He strained, pushing himself up to a sitting position with a series of groans and metallic protests. The sound was prodigious in the stillness of the pre-dawn, a one-man percussion section of utter misery. He reached, with his rigid, gauntleted fingers, for the buckle of his helm. It was stiff, unyielding. He fumbled, cursing under his breath steaming inside the cold metal. Finally, with a desperate tug, the buckle gave way. He lifted the helm, its weight a familiar burden, and set it down with a soft, dull white wampum beside him. The rush of cool, damp air was a revelation, a sudden, glorious invasion of his senses. He could breathe, truly breathe, deeply and without restriction, filling his lungs with the fresh, earthy scent of the beleaguered camp, rather than his own stale breath. He could see again, the muted gray of the pre-dawn expanding into a full, wide panorama of the tent's interior. But the itch persisted, a fiery beacon on his thigh. He began with desperate urgency to unbuckle the gorget, then the breastplate. Each strap was a small victory, each release a profound, if temporary, relief. The cuirass, once a formidable fortress, was now simply a heavy, cumbersome burden. He managed to push it off, allowing it to fall with a muffled thudding onto the straw beside him. The immediate sensation of the weight lifting from his chest was akin to being released from the bottom of a murky pond. He gasped, sucking in great gulps of air, feeling his ribs expand freely for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He ran his ungauntleted hand, he must have taken the gauntlets off in a previous unremembered attempt at comfort, down his sweat-soaked gambeson, rubbing desperately at the maddening itch on his thigh. Oh, the profound, almost spiritual relief of it. The friction, the blessed friction, dissolving the torment, leaving behind only the dull ache of chafed skin. He worked faster now, with a renewed sense of purpose. The vambraces came off, revealing his damp, constricted forearms. Then the cuisses, the greaves, each a heavy, rigid tube of metal, releasing his legs into a glorious, if cramp-ridden, freedom. He pulled off the mail shirt, its heavy chainmail clinking like 1,000 tiny bells as it pooled around him. Finally, the gambeson, that sweat-soaked, clammy cocoon, was peeled away, piece by painful piece. He was left in his damp, rough linen underclothes, shivering slightly in the cold, damp air, but gloriously, utterly free of the steel. He lay back on the damp straw, his body still aching, his skin still clammy, but now he could stretch. He could bend his knees. He could cross his legs. He could curl into a fetal position, something utterly impossible mere minutes before. He could scratch any itch anywhere. The silence after the clanking symphony of his removal was profound, broken only by the gentle patter of rain and the distant organic sounds of the camp. He was still uncomfortable, still exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a measure of true physical freedom. Sleep, when it came, was not perfect. It was still shallow, still imperfect, still haunted by the dampness and the hard ground, and the lingering aches of his long, armored ordeal. But it was sleep. It was unburdened by steel, unmarred by pressure points, unamplified by internal echoes, and crucially unplagued by the unscratchable torment of a metallic prison. He woke a few hours later, still stiff, still tired, but not with the profound bruised misery of having slept in his armor. He was merely tired, as a normal human might be. As the sun finally rose, casting a pale, watery light over the besieged camp, Sir Calen looked at his gleaming, formidable armor, now lying in its component pieces beside him, an impressive yet profoundly useless pile of metal for the purpose of rest. He felt a wry, almost tragicomic sense of relief. The constant fear of a sudden attack might be real, but the physical and psychological toll of perpetually enduring his own protection had proven to be a greater, more insidious enemy. His armor had reached its last straw, and in that moment, for Sir Calen, the choice was clear. No amount of perceived readiness was worth another night of that particular metallic hell. He would face tomorrow's battles with less sleep, perhaps, but with a newfound, profound appreciation for the simple, unarmored freedom of his own skin. And he would never, ever try to sleep in that damn suit of armor again. Chapter 19. Modern parallels we have, by this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, painstakingly dissected the manifold agonies that would befall a medieval knight so unwise, or so grimly necessitated, as to attempt slumber within the gleaming, yet profoundly hostile confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized possession. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable, humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch. That petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom, snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. We acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate, the raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness, making his armor a grim, necessary nightmare. We debunked the notion of the noble Snooze, replacing it with the gritty, uncomfortable truth, and contrasted the knight's metallic misery with the humble, surprisingly luxurious freedom of the peasant's sleep. Finally, we pulled back the curtain on the armorers, who, with sly wit, knew their creations were, in fact, masterfully crafted torture chambers for anyone attempting to rest within them. And we concluded with the tragicomic relief of Sir Calen, who reached his metallic last straw, forsaking his armor for the elusive promise of genuine slumber. Now, dear listener, having thoroughly immersed ourselves in the intricate, albeit utterly miserable, nocturnal existence of the armored knight, let us draw a few, perhaps rather sardonic, comparisons to our own modern struggles with the elusive art of sleep. While we, in our climate-controlled bedrooms with our memory foam mattresses and various technological distractions, face different demons, the fundamental human body's complaints against true repose, when sufficiently provoked, often echo across the centuries. It is an ironic twist that many of the specific torments endured by a knight in his unyielding steel find their contemporary, albeit less physically brutal, parallels in the myriad sleep disorders and disruptions that plague modern humanity. Consider, for instance, the knight's perpetual state of shallow, fragmented unconsciousness. He would drift into a doze, only to be jolted awake by a pressure point, a sudden clank, the stifling heat, or the maddening inability to scratch an itch. Does this not sound remarkably similar to insomnia, that modern bane of restful nights? Not the romanticized poetic insomnia of late-night contemplation, but the grim, exhausting reality of staring at the inside of your eyelids for hours, desperate for sleep that perpetually remains just out of reach. The knight's armor was his external insomnia, a physical manifestation of his inability to achieve continuous, restorative sleep. He was trapped in a cycle of brief, unfulfilling micro-sleeps, constantly aware of his discomfort, his brain unable to enter the deeper, restorative stages. Modern insomniacs, though free from steel, often experience this same fragmented, unsatisfying rest, their minds unable to quiet, their bodies unable to relax, simply lacking the convenient excuse of a 70-pound metal suit. Then there is the knight's constant struggle with immobility, particularly in his lower limbs. His legs, encased in greaves and cuisses, were locked into an inflexible posture, unable to bend, to stretch, to find a comfortable position. Every unconscious twitch, every internal urge to shift, would be met with the unyielding embrace of cold steel, creating a profound, maddening sensation of trapped restlessness. This, dear listener, bears a striking resemblance to what we now clinically term restless legs syndrome, or RLS. That maddening, irresistible urge to move one's legs, especially when at rest, often accompanied by unpleasant creeping, crawling, or tingling sensations. Imagine that sensation, magnified by the total inability to actually move the limb, to find that moment of temporary relief by stretching or shifting. The knight experienced a form of medically induced RLs, his armor acting as the external force that amplified a universal physiological irritation into an exquisite torture. His brain would send the signal to move, to alleviate the discomfort, and his armor would offer a blunt, metallic refusal, trapping him in a loop of unfulfilled primal urges. And let us not forget the profound impact on his breathing. The weight of the cuirass pressing on his chest, especially when lying flat, made each inhalation a conscious effort, a shallow, restricted gasp for air. The stale, humid air inside his helmet, combined with the amplification of his own breath and any snores, creates another disturbing parallel. This brings to mind sleep apnea, a condition where breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep. While the knight's condition wasn't due to collapsing airways in the same medical sense, his experience shared the core elements: restricted airflow, labored breathing, and the jarring, amplified sounds of his own respiratory efforts, leading to repeated awakenings and profoundly unrefreshing sleep. His armor was an external CPAP machine, only one designed by a particularly sardonic medieval engineer, intent on making every breath a conscious struggle. The sensory assaults, too, have their modern counterparts. The maddening, unscratchable itch, amplified by sweat and the sheer impossibility of relief, resonates with the nocturnal torments of eczema or other chronic skin conditions that worsen at night, denying sufferers the simple comfort of scratching. The helmet's echo, transforming every internal gurgle and heartbeat into a booming symphony, could be compared to extreme hypersensitivity or even certain forms of tinnitus, where internal or subtle sounds become overwhelmingly loud and intrusive, preventing the mind from quietening for sleep. Preventing the mind from quietening for sleep. The knight in his metallic chamber experienced a comprehensive sensory distortion, a perpetual assault on his auditory and tactile senses that made peaceful slumber an impossibility. Furthermore, the knight's constant hypervigilance, his inability to fully relax due to the ever-present threat of attack, particularly if he chose to sleep in armor out of fear, mirrors the sleep disturbances associated with anxiety disorders or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The mind perpetually on alert, unable to truly switch off its internal guard, even when the body is exhausted. The fragmented sleep, the nightmares of vulnerability, the heightened startle response to innocuous sounds, these are common threads between the battle-weary knight and the modern individual, whose mind refuses to grant them the peace of deep sleep due to pervasive apprehension or past trauma. The armor in these cases became both the symbol and the physical manifestation of that unshakable dread. Even the fundamental concept of poor sleep hygiene finds its ludicrous medieval equivalent. We are advised to sleep in a cool, dark, quiet, and comfortable environment, free from distractions. The knight in armor experienced the precise opposite, a hot, humid, clammy, noisy, physically painful, and utterly distracting enclosure where every basic principle of restful sleep was systematically violated. No amount of medieval mindfulness or counting rivets could overcome the inherent design flaws of sleeping in a suit of plate. It's a masterclass in how we tea to prepare for slumber. The irony, then, is that while we, in the 21st century, meticulously study sleep cycles, prescribe medications, and develop ergonomic pillows to combat our various sleep woes, the medieval knight faced a compounded version of many of these same problems, all bundled into one gleaming, heavy, and utterly unforgiving pack. His struggle was not abstract or psychological in its primary cause. It was concrete, metallic, and inescapable. He was a living, breathing case study in extreme sleep deprivation, a walking advertisement for the benefits of a simple, unencumbered bed. His sleep issues weren't a matter of brain chemistry or lifestyle choices. They were a direct consequence of his attire. So, as we toss and turn on our comparatively plush mattresses, perhaps frustrated by a noisy neighbor, a lingering worry, or a too warm room, let us spare a thought for the knight. His restless night was not merely a historical curiosity. It was a profound, visceral demonstration of how the human body protests against confinement, discomfort, and the absence of basic physiological needs. His sleep, a tapestry woven from pressure, sweat, noise, and fear, serves as a poignant, darkly humorous reminder that some torments are universal, regardless of the era. And while our modern sleep disorders may feel uniquely ours, the knight, in his clanking, uncomfortable shell, was grappling with very similar fundamental issues, simply amplified to an almost comical, and certainly sleepless degree. His was a life and a night that truly illustrated the age-old truth. Sometimes the very thing designed to protect you becomes your greatest, most inescapable tormentor. Chapter 20. The end of the Iron Knight. We have, by this prolonged and rather discomforting narrative, painstakingly dissected the manifold agonies that would befall a medieval knight so unwise or so grimly necessitated as to attempt slumber within the gleaming yet profoundly hostile confines of his plate armor. We have grappled with the crushing, unrelenting gravitational weight that defied all notions of rest, contended with the suffocating embrace of unyielding steel that rendered natural movement a tantalizing, unattainable fantasy, and wrestled with the insidious, ever-present threat of rust, that creeping destroyer of a knight's most prized possession. We endured the relentless, cacophonous, clanking symphony that accompanied every futile shift, and sweated profusely through the inescapable humid microclimate that transformed the knight's personal space into a mobile, metallic sauna. We even commiserated over the exquisite, maddening torment of the unscratchable itch, that petty tyranny capable of driving the most stoic warrior to the brink of raving lunacy. In his few, fragmented moments of dream, we saw how the very concept of mobility became a cruel, ironic jest, a fleeting vision of freedom snatched away by the encroaching, hardening steel of his subconscious. We witnessed the weary plight of the squire, perpetually tasked with navigating this metal-encased misery, and explored the absurd, desperate rituals a knight might devise to render his torment fractionally less unbearable. We acknowledged the chilling reason why a knight might choose such a fate, the raw, primal fear of a swift, unprepared end in the darkness, making his armor a grim, necessary nightmare. We debunked the notion of the noble snooze, replacing it with the gritty, uncomfortable truth, and contrasted the knight's metallic misery with the humble, surprisingly luxurious freedom of the peasant's sleep. We pulled back the curtain on the armorers who, with sly wit, knew their creations were, in fact, masterfully crafted torture chambers for anyone attempting to rest within them. And we concluded with the tragicomic relief of Sir Calen, who reached his metallic last straw, forsaking his armor for the elusive promise of genuine slumber. Now, dear listener, as our lengthy, rather clanking journey through the sleepless nights of medieval chivalry draws to a close, let us gather our wits, perhaps stretch our limbs, a luxury denied to our armored protagonists for so long. The verdict, one hopes, is now as clear as a newly polished breastplate on a clear morning. Sleeping in a full suit of armor was, without a shadow of a doubt, a singularly terrible, horrible, no good, very bad idea, and one, most emphatically, that you should not, under any circumstances, attempt to replicate at home, even for the sake of historical authenticity or a particularly vivid costume party. The very core of the problem, as we have seen, lay in a profound, almost cosmic misunderstanding between human physiology and medieval engineering. Armor was a masterpiece of defense, a triumph of metalwork designed to keep a living, breathing, vulnerable body from being perforated by very sharp or very blunt objects. It excelled at this. But the human body, when seeking sleep, craves softness, flexibility, warmth without stifling heat, coolness without chill, and above all, the freedom to shift, to stretch, to alleviate pressure points, and to scratch those maddening itches that appear from nowhere precisely when one is on the precipice of slumber. The armor, by its very nature, offered the precise antithesis of all these fundamental needs. It was hard where softness was desired, rigid where flexibility was craved, and an oven of sweat where gentle ventilation was essential. It transformed the subconscious act of finding repose into a conscious, laborious battle against immovable steel. The knight, in his shining panoply, was less a sleeping warrior and more a human statue, eternally poised between the waking agony of his physical confinement and the fleeting, fragmented moments of a sleep that offered no true solace. His internal world, amplified by the helmet's echo, became a cacophony of his own biological functions, a grotesque soundscape that mocked any attempted quietude. His external movements, however slight, were met with a clanking symphony of metallic protest, announcing his every futile shift to anyone within earshot, and certainly to himself. The specter of rust, that creeping decay, served as a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, a reminder that even his most prized possession was relentlessly under siege by the very elements. And the unscratchable itch, that most petty yet potent of torments, was perhaps the most exquisitely cruel joke of all, reducing a formidable warrior to a helpless, squirming mass of frustrated skin and unyielding steel. We observed the weary squires, those unsung heroes of medieval logistics, who bore witness to this nightly torment and were tasked with the laborious, often malodorous, process of disrobing and redressing their grumpy, stiff, and utterly exhausted lord. Their sardonic sympathy was the only true comfort in a world defined by the metallic shell. We laughed, gently, ironically, at the absurd bedtime rituals, the desperate, almost ceremonial loosening of straps, and the futile placement of improvised padding, all designed to achieve a state that was merely less horrible rather than genuinely comfortable. We acknowledged the chilling necessity that sometimes drove a knight to this choice, the primal fear of an unforeseen attack, but ultimately recognized that the solution, the armor itself, became a new internal nightmare, a self-imposed prison of vigilance. And in comparing the night's metallic misery to our own modern sleep woes, we found a peculiar, humbling irony. While we fret over thread counts, screen time, and the optimal firmness of a mattress, the knight wrestled with a profoundly amplified version of similar physiological complaints. His armor was his chronic insomnia, his restless leg syndrome, his sleep apnea, his unscratchable eczema, and his PTSD, all rolled into one impossibly heavy, unyielding package. His struggle was not abstract. It was concrete, metallic, and inescapable, a perpetual reminder of how profoundly different the human body's needs are from the demands of medieval warfare. So, as we bring this chronicle of metallic slumber to its rightful conclusion, let us offer a final reflective thought. History, for all its grand narratives of kings and battles, often conceals a multitude of such mundane, yet utterly debilitating, miseries. It reminds us that even the most powerful, the most romanticized figures of the past were still fundamentally human, susceptible to the same aches, pains, and irritations that plague us today, only often amplified to an almost comical degree by the very technology and circumstances of their age. The knight in shining armor, a symbol of strength and nobility, becomes, in the cold light of historical reality, a rather pathetic figure when attempting to curl up for a quick kip. His knights, then, were not of glorious dreams of valor, but of pressure points, clammy sweat, clanking joints, and the maddening, unyielding itch of 1,000 tiny, unseen torments. The armor, his gleaming, magnificent shield in battle, became his personal dungeon in the dark, a testament to the peculiar, often humorous ironies of human existence across the vast expanse of time. Let us take solace in our own comparatively plush, unarmored beds, grateful for the simple, profound luxury of being able to stretch, to shift, to truly relax, and to scratch that particularly persistent itch without the pervasive, clanking judgment of 50 pounds of unforgiving steel. The iron night of the medieval night has passed, leaving behind a legacy not of epic slumber, but of profound, unadulterated, and historically accurate discomfort. And that, dear listener, is the unvarnished, entirely unsleepy truth.